If this fiendish thing was done, what do we do with the information that exists? I suspect that the concentration camp inmates would have wanted to have the information used to help somebody, end quote. The Nazi data are the only available experimental information on the effect of phosgene on human beings. Although the experiments allegedly were poorly designed, the data are considered to be useful. An EPA toxicologist insisted that similar information coming, for example, from an industrial accident exposing workers to the chemical would prove invaluable. He then went on to say, quote, "My personal opinion is that when data is collected in an unethical fashion, if it is important in protecting public health and is not available in any other way, I would use it," end quote. One of my critics, in response to the op-ed article I eventually wrote, asked, quote, "Is it fair to those people currently being exposed to the chemical to pretend that applicable data do not exist? Can the ethical questions be so compelling that we ignore information that might conceivably reduce the amount of unethical practices, that will reduce the amount of human suffering and misery currently being experienced," end quote. When I first received the invitation to write the op-ed article, I thought that I would answer the question affirmatively. That is, that I would defend the use of the data. For in my prior work, I had always taken the position, contrary to many others, including editors of scientific medical journals, that unethically obtained data should be published, not so much for reason of their scientific contribution to the cure of disease, but for two different reasons. One, to alert the scientific community and the public to the fact that unethical research is still being conducted. For without such an awareness, unethical practices will not come under better control. And two, to bring the offending medical scientists before duly authorized committees that will review their conduct and impose sanctions, severe ones if indicated. Of course, I was often praised for my views on publication and criticized for my views on sanctions. I soon realized that my reasons for publishing contemporary unethically conducted research had no relevance to the question before me, because the Nazi experiments, one, are part of history, and no one questions that they were unethical, and two, the physicians involved had been brought to justice. After agonizing over the questions posed, writing draft after draft, and being mindful of having to express my views in 750 words, I finally concluded that the data should not be used. Some of you may have run across the article. It was widely reprinted. The published version departed for a variety of reasons from the original one. I would like to quote brief excerpts from the original draft. Quote, "The conduct of the Nazi physician-scientists was barbarous, revolting, monstrous, devoid of any decency. Their research defiled human beings, medicine, science, and humanity. They dragged through bloody mud an honorable profession to which contemporary physician-scientists who now wish to make use of these results belong. My answer is this: whatever the benefit to mankind, the result of the experiments should be condemned to oblivion. The experiment's only benefit resides in bringing them, with results omitted, to the attention of the world. Before giving my reasons, let me tell you what my reasons are not. I do not believe that in using the results we condone the experiments. Whatever we do with the data, the experiments cannot be condoned. Nor do I believe that by publishing the results we invite their repetition. For if ever repeated, the world will have descended into hell once again, and then nothing will save us. Nor do I believe that using the data with appropriate acknowledgement of their source can truly etch onto our minds the horrors of what had transpired. For deriving benefits from them will compel us immediately to suppress their origins out of guilt over having benefited from such bloody deeds. Nor do I believe that we give a shred of meaning to the victims' lives and suffering by using the data. for we're dishonoring them even more by feasting on their bodies. These experiments should never have been conducted. These results should never have been obtained. Let us not forget that. Thus, my reason for not using the data for our benefit is this: their use may dehumanize us as conducting the experiments with the Nazi physicians, end quote. It was hard for me to write what I did. If I had to say it again in 750 words, I would change little. But now I can say just a little bit more. On reflection, mine was a most personal reaction, influenced by what the Nazis had done to my relatives, to my people. I now ask myself, would I have reacted similarly if the data had come from Armenian, Chinese, Pakistani research subjects, or if the experiments had been conducted a century earlier? I continue to ask myself this question because I know how easy it is to become insensitive to the suffering of those to whom we are not intimately related. Freud spoke of the narcissism of minor differences that reinforces human beings' inclination to aggression, and if not to aggression, then at least to indifference. Between strangers, homo homini lupus, man is a wolf to man. I shall say something more about this momentarily. For now, let the admission suffice that mine was also, in the light of my history, a most personal reaction, yet it is not entirely that. While I would not make use of the data, what about others? Consider first that the concentration camp research data are in the public domain. They are available to anyone. Thus, to prohibit their use requires state action. In arguing against their use, I do not wish to endorse governmental censorship. I am opposed to censorship. At the same time, a different form of censorship or disapproval would concern me less. For example, the refusal of editors of scientific journals to publish articles that made use of such data. Nor would I be troubled if scientific organizations were to caution their colleagues about the use of the data on ethical grounds, or even to suggest that they not be used. At a minimum, I would suggest the following. The journal editors and scientific organizations insist that any article that made use of the data include a sufficiently detailed descriptions of where they came from, including their blood and tear-soaked history. They should also insist that the author set forth why he resolved the ethical dilemma in favor of using the Nazi data. Merely referring, as has so often been done, by a footnote to the Dachau experiments is just not enough. And ultimately, I would leave it to the individual conscience of investigators to decide whether to use the data or not. However, I would like them to be aware that in making use of the data, they force science to confront an examination of its own values. Science is not value-free, as the tension between the advancement of science and protection of the inviolability of the subjects of research alone demonstrates. The oft-advanced claim that science is totally objective, and that therefore the Nazi data are merely objective scientific findings, constitutes a cruel deception of self, of science, and of the subjects of research. It denies that the data are soaked in blood, agony, and death. Thus, in using the data, scientists make a political and not only a scientific decision. There is a distinction between developing a hydrogen bomb and using it. When Oppenheimer testified before the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission, after admitting, as I've already quoted, that one had to at least make the bomb, he went on to say, quote, "Then the only problem was, what would we do about these bombs once we had them," end quote. We have the Nazi experimental data. The question now before us is, what shall we do with them? This is not only, if at all, as I've said, a scientific judgment. It is foremost a political one. However hard we may try, we cannot separate the data from the way they were obtained. If science eschews the Nazi scientific methodology of subject selection and treatment, the question must be faced. Should a judgment of unacceptable methodology relegate the findings to oblivion, as would be the case if the judgment were made that the research was so faulty that the results were worthless? I only note in passing that one dangerous proposition advanced by some commentators and scientists in an attempt to isolate the Nazi data from all other research studies can be put to rest. Namely, quote, that experiments which are ethically unsound are also scientifically unsound, end quote. If that proposition were true, then many experimental studies conducted throughout the world would be unsound and invalid. This is just not so. My reasons, my own personal history notwithstanding for not using the data, are difficult to put into words, but try I must. I would like to begin by quoting from an article that I wrote when I asked to speak on my role in the history of the regulation of human research. Quote, as I reflect about the history of human experimentation, I find in it much that attests to the perseverance, idealism, and sacrifice of investigators. We can only admire and be grateful to these intrepid pioneers. At the same time, I can also find in this history much that is sordid, frightening, and unconscionable. That this is so should come as no surprise. The abuse only testifies to the all-too-human proclivities for aggression. Physicians and researchers are not exempt from this dynamism. Indeed, they are particularly vulnerable to them because their dedication to the advancement of science can blind them to the human costs of research. Denial and rationalization are powerful allies of aggression. In the waning years of my life, the problem of aggression has increasingly preoccupied me. The history of human experimentation testifies to the ubiquity of aggression, however much obscured by physician scientists' caring dedication to alleviate mankind's pain and suffering from the ravages of disease. My colleague, the late Robert Cover, when writing about judicial sentencing, reminded us that, quote, judges deal in pain and death, end quote. He went on to say, quote, that persons, he meant judges, but he could have said it about physicians as well, act within social organizations that exercise authority violently without experiencing the normal degree of inhibition which regulates the behavior of those who act autonomously, end quote. The violent authority that physician can exercise is obscured by the social organization of the caretaking institutions within which they operate, as is the violence of judges who work within the halls of justice. Many advances in medicine might have been more slow in coming had physician investigators pursued their clinical search less aggressively by not engineering consent. Would it have been a price worth paying, even though the suffering of future patients might have remained for a while longer without relief? The answer is difficult to give. Perhaps we can only remind ourselves from time to time of the nagging questions. We have not been very successful in containing human aggression and evil. Perhaps this is an instance when we can, by proclaiming at a personal price to mankind, perhaps this is an instance when we can, by proclaiming and at a personal price to mankind and personal advancement, that we shall not use the data, that we shall suffer too as the victims did. If we want to keep the Holocaust alive not as a historical, but as a contemporary manifestation of our aggressive proclivities, if we want to give meaning to and honor the victims, we may also wish to abstain from benefiting from such bloody deeds. For the real and nagging questions are, can we simultaneously repudiate and benefit from evil? In choosing to benefit from evil and making it part of our own history, will we perpetuate evil? Perhaps in refusing to benefit, knowing that we could benefit, we may take a small step towards the eradication of evil in our world. Nothing else has worked. I must admit that I'm troubled by my conclusions. I'm a physician dedicated to the alleviation of suffering. Perhaps I have been too passionate. If I have, I hope that you can also find reason in my remarks. I do not apologize for my passion, for reason alone can send us on the road to hell just as inexorably as passion alone can. The two are inextricably intertwined. Reason and passion are needed if we ever wish to become responsible and caring human beings. For as Edmund Kahn once put it, quote, to possess the end and yet not to be responsible for the means, to grasp the fruit while disavowing the tree, that has throughout the ages been mankind's chief hypocrisy, end quote. In conclusion, I would like to tell you that I experienced much pain in re-immersing myself in this literature and writing this paper. I hope, even if you disagree with me, that I've done some justice to this complex problem. Habet mundus istes suas noctes et non paucas. This world has its nights, and they are not few in number. I do not have a vision of a new dawn that will vanquish evil. I leave such visions to the prophets. I only wanted to pierce the darkness with a few rays of light. If I have succeeded in that and not made matters darker, I have done all that I intended to do. Thank you.
We're going to continue the same format for questions, which is any of you who have questions or comments, we encourage and appreciate them. You have cards in your packets, and if you just hold them up, someone will collect them and bring them up. The one other change in format is that the camera people and some of the audience asked if the responder could please stand and the questioner please sit. And that's the reason for changing places, and Dr. Katz has consented to this change. We have one question from an earlier session, but that actually fits this one. And it's related to the Tuskegee experiments. When the experiment was finally stopped, it was because of the efforts of the press to keep the spotlight on until the study was investigated. Justifications provided by the medical and government participants fall easily into the causes you describe. Legal response did not seem appropriate for the magnitude of the ethical offense. Since this was but a decade ago, do you think this lack of action is indicative of existing legal and moral stance in America today? So has it changed over the last 10 years?
Matters have changed, I believe. To that extent, I'm an optimist. Matters have changed that experiments like Tuskegee probably could not be conducted in the United States at this time, and surely not on this kind of a massive scale. What hasn't changed significantly as yet, and cannot change, as I try to make clear in what I've said this evening, is to prevent dignitary harm to patients, dignitary abuse, by not really fully informing them about their participation in research, particularly patient subjects who are also hospitalized for therapeutic reasons. Evasions are very, very common. As recently, one researcher told a class of medical students, and he was forthright to admit that he had to tamper somewhat with the informed consent requirement. because otherwise it would take too long to conscript enough research subjects. And he had to do research in order to justify the research grants he was getting, and in order to obtain research money to support him and his assistants, and also for purposes of writing papers and securing his advancements. These are tremendous tensions that to which investigators are exposed because of the nature of the game. And as I've indicated, physical abuse on any kind of major scale is reasonably well controlled and quite satisfactorily controlled by and large. But if you are concerned, as I'm concerned, about abuse to the dignity of persons' personhood, namely their right to be the final choice makers, whether to participate in research or not, if that is important, and I think it is, then in this respect, we have to still go a long, long way.
Thank you. A distinction. In your analysis of the exploitation of physician-scientists, do you see any difference between the atrocities of the physician-clinician and the physician-researcher?
That is a good question, one that would take a long time to answer, because the two of them are inextricably intertwined. Again, it's late, and so a very brief a bit of personal history. When many years ago, it was in the days when there were only a handful of us, Henry Beecher amongst them, who were interested in the study of human experimentation, my colleagues at Yale Medical School were very upset at what I was beginning to teach, to think about, to talk about, and they said, "Let sleeping dogs sleep, and don't make noises." Now, when Tuskegee broke and Jewish Gynecological Disease Hospital and other similar cases, they began to applaud me. Jay, you've been in the forefront of the advancement of something, whatever you might want to call it, and they began to applaud me. A few years later, in listening to me, they said, "Jay, you should stop talking again." And I knew what they were talking about, and I said, "Why?" And they said, "Look, we are listening to you very, very carefully, and what's happening to you now is that you're turning away from research, and you are thinking about exploring the physician-patient relationship." I hadn't said it explicitly yet, but they were quite right, because it gradually, I've been working in the control of in the problems of human research for 7-8 years, and it finally dawned upon me that to understand what's going on in research, you have to go back to the analysis of the and exploration of the physician-patient relationship. To me, a much more difficult and complex problem than human research. The two are inextricably intertwined, and as I try to say in my paper, I don't want to put it in terms of monstrous things being done, but thoughtless things being done. And those of you who know my work appreciate that I think that the physician, the patient must become an important participant in the medical decision-making process. This is a novel idea for medicine. It has not been part of medical thinking to any great extent prior to 1957, when the first informed consent decision was handed down. So we're dealing with an idea that is only 30 years young or old, and confronts a 2,000-year history of medical authoritarianism. I think both for research and for practice, the issue is, and the problem is, how can we give patients a greater role in the decision-making process? And to do that, and for that to happen, probably will take another 20, 30, 40, 50 years.
The next is probably a psychoanalyst question. In providing your root causes, are you rationalizing an essentially insane phenomenon?
No. No, I think this is the worst thing I think we could do, is to call the Nazi experience an insane phenomenon. I think it also would do an injustice, by the way, to the Holocaust by isolating the Holocaust as an insane act or as a Jewish Nazi issue. What transpired in Nazi Germany, including the Holocaust, is a human problem. It is a problem that afflicts us in much more minor ways in all the institutions in which we are working. As I said towards the end of my talk, we have not sufficiently addressed, and hopefully Dr. Kaplan at this institute will begin to do it, is how to control human aggression. To me, this is one of the most fundamental problems that we face as human beings, and have swept and continue to sweep under the carpet. For a while, Judeo-Christian ethics has not helped us here, because it had emphasized too much the brotherhood of men and sisterhood of men and women, and had sort of sidestepped the problem of aggression. It was, as many of you know, the first problem that the writers of Genesis addressed after the expulsion from paradise. So they thought it was an important issue. But we need to appreciate that it stalks all human life, all human interactions, and that's why I think Bob Cover's comment that I briefly quoted is so important, is that it invades our institutional structures. It invades our institutional structures that are devoted to healing, that are devoted to dispensing justice, and therefore we barely perceive how much aggressiveness is part of our way of life. The Nazis only, to me, illustrate what can go wrong, almost like an atomic bomb, when all these forces converge. We can only diffuse them by doing a little bit better in the way in which we interact with one another. maybe more inhumanly, but being a little bit nicer to one another, because usually we say what is human is to be nice, aspirationally correct, but in practice it is inhumanity that is much more the human way of interacting.
This is a comment in case you want to take a breather. In support of your thought that to not use the data may conflict with the goal of an MD to heal, perhaps it is appropriate to also point out that there's a physical healing which this data might advance, and moral and spiritual healing which perhaps would be a better goal. For instance, by denying this data in all its aspects, we may be looking at a better goal. One historical clarification, it says you gave as one of the root causes of the scientific community's conduct obedience to the Fuhrer. Isn't it true that Hitler never gave an order to exterminate Jews, gypsies, and the mentally ill? Didn't he just give permission to psychiatrists to use their own judgments in treating patients with no hope? And wasn't it the psychiatrists on their own who determined to do mass extermination? Thank you.
Yeah, as I did not state it as accurately as I should have. As you know, there's still a great debate going on as to who ordered it. No documents have been traced directly to Hitler. The question is, was it a verbal command by Hitler to Himmler? And who was Hitler actively or less actively involved in this? But of course, be that as it may, the leadership of Nazi Germany knew, condoned, and surely Himmler actively expedited the extermination of Jews throughout the Nazi territory.
We'll need to limit this to 2 concluding questions. For the ones that we don't get to, I'll save them and see if we can put them into other question periods during the rest of the sessions. This is kind of an implementation question. There's a perverse logic to the Nazis' practice. If the patient is the Aryan race, then it is good medical practice to remove the gangrenous appendix. The following, as you noted, is a violation of individual autonomy and personhood. How in the areas of medical, education, public policy, and scientific practice do we inculcate the value of human personhood? As a practical matter, how can we ensure the principle remains paramount?
Well, strange as may sound, we first have to agree on the proposition that we should put the principle of personhood first. I think it will be a long time in coming, if it ever comes, that in human research that principle will be put first. And by that I mean, as I try to suggest, that advancement of science comes second, and that we are willing to forego certain scientific advances because of even minimal human costs involved. That will take a long time, because my hunch is that we will continue with the notion that we will balance human inviolability against the claims of science. And I tried as best I could to point out to you the dangers of such balancing. And because very, very likely then person's inviolability will to some minor or greater extent be not fully taken into account. And if we want to continue behaving this way, at least let us acknowledge it and admit to what we're doing and express our willingness to pay the price. I didn't have a time, even though Arthur Kaplan asked me to do so, to comment on the existing regulations and the various codes for the protection of human research. In response to this question, let me just say something about the Declaration of Helsinki. I read it carefully 3-4 times last week, and this is what I found. In its important basic principle sections, which is the first section of the Declaration of Helsinki, there is no mention of protection of the subjects of research or informed consent. It only talks about advancing science, conducting experiments scientifically. It talks a little bit about balancing. Then it has 2 additional sections. One, clinical research, and the final section is non-clinical research, mostly with volunteers and mostly with non-patients. In the clinical research section, there is some brief discussion of the issue of informed consent, but only in the non-clinical research section appears a statement that the protection of personhood comes first. Now, to me, that indicates something about priorities. If we were to take personhood seriously, then that statement should come first. It should be part of the basic principles section. It should be the first statement in the basic principles section, and the rest should become secondary. But this is asking for too much. The Nuremberg Code, at least, put voluntary consent first as a first principle. But then feeling so upset by the Holocaust and the revelations at Nuremberg, they wrote a voluntary consent requirement that if seriously attended to, probably would make any kind of research impossible, because no human being could obtain get the consent from a subject, or no subject could be consent. This is a little bit of an overstatement, not too much of an overstatement, to the requirements imposed in Section 1 of the Nuremberg Code. But I'm sorry I couldn't tell you more about that this evening.
The final question. When referring to the term research, one thinks of some sort of systematic scientific process. I find the utterly torturous methods used by the Nazi doctors towards their victims difficult to align with research. How is it that they are even classified as experiments?
I do not know how to respond to the question, and there may be, and I may not do it justice in what I'm saying, because the writer of this question may have had something else in mind. It seems to me not to call it research would be very, very dangerous. Maybe it was torturous research, maybe it was not well designed, but any of you who've sat on human experimentation committees know how many inelegant experiments are also presented to committees, and as long as they are ethically sound, when I used to sit on human experimentation committees, we let them pass, because we thought we had enough to do, and we didn't want to get involved in helping the research scientists, applicants, by improving their research methodology. Be that as it may, there's a lot of, maybe the Nazis could have designed the experiments better, but this was research, I believe. This was done with the intention of doing research, with the intention of advancing science. I think that this research contributed to human knowledge. It is, and let us not try, unless the writer had something else in mind, again to isolate these experiments as if they came from Mars, are not part of our own world and our own experience. There were human beings involved on both sides, both the experimenters and the victims. And it says something, and these experiments say something about the human conditions. These experiments, of course, are, as I said repeatedly, were done on such a horrendous and scale and with such fiendishness that in that sense they are an aberration. But in many other ways they are not an aberrations. They say something about scientific life, medical sciences life, and human life, and there are lessons to be learned from this event, and to that extent we can, I think, sanctify and celebrate the victims by being willing for once to look at ourselves and look at how we can behave towards one another, and to find out to what extent, to be sure, in much more minor ways we behave in similar ways towards one another, and as professionals towards our patient subjects. There's much to be learned here, and I hope we will learn it. Thank you.
We have many more questions left to address than we already have, so we hope you'll join us tomorrow to continue to do that. I'm sorry we don't have all evening to continue. I also think that's an indicator, Dr. Katz, that you've succeeded in making us look at ourselves and our society, and perhaps we'll address more subtle dangers for the future. I thank you very much. We'll reconvene at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. Thank you for coming.
In Berlin and Himmler in Dachau for enemies of the state. In 1934, 181 genetic health courts and appellate genetic health courts are established to administer the law for the prevention of the genetically diseased. Doctors are required to register all genetic defectives as defined by the law earlier and to undergo training in genetic pathology in order to identify them. Fisher and Lenz, in March of 1935, with other doctors and civil servants, discussed the problem in a series of newspaper and magazine articles of what to do about the Rhineland bastards, so-called, mixed-race children resulting from the occupation of the German Rhineland after the First World War by French colonial troops from Africa. September 1935, the Nuremberg laws are passed, which exclude Jews from citizenship, prohibit marriage and sexual intercourse between Jews and citizens of Germany or of German blood. All prospective marriage partners are to be examined by a physician to prevent racial pollution. In 1936, psychiatrist Robert Ritter starts a study to identify who are gypsies in Germany. I won't go into it now, but eventually that study is used to exterminate all 26,500 gypsies in Germany according to Ritter's biological classification system. In spring of 1937, the sterilizations of the Rhineland bastards are carried out. In March of 1938, Professor Kleist at Frankfurt reports on the mental hospital nearby at Herborn. It was one of several where the killing of patients through hunger and untreated illness have become established policy. His report concludes, as long as there is no law for the destruction of lives unworthy to be lived, those who are beyond cure have the right to humane treatment which assures their continued existence. Expenditure on these unfortunates should not be allowed to fall below a certain minimum level. He's fired. Sometime later, 5 professors of psychiatry, along with Professor Lenz and other SS doctors, draft a law to permit the killing of psychiatric patients. In a lecture in 1939, in June, Fisher argues, when a people wants somehow or other to preserve its own nature, it must reject alien racial elements. And when these have already insinuated themselves, it must suppress and eliminate them. The Jew is such an alien, and therefore when he wants to insinuate himself, he must be warded off. This is self-defense. In saying this, I do not characterize every Jew as inferior, as Negroes are, and I do not underestimate the greater enemy with whom we have to fight. He means the Soviet Union. But I reject Jewry with every means in my power without reserve in order to preserve the hereditary endowment of my people. Just about that same time, Interior Minister Frick orders all twins born in the Reich to be registered with public health officials for purposes of genetic research. The point of this review of some of the facts from 1913 up until the start of the war is simply to persuade you of a few key points. First, mainstream scientists were providing the racial hygiene theory that gave support and implementation possibilities for Nazi ideology. Second, there was an active, reciprocal, symbiotic relationship between the medical and scientific communities and the Nazi Party. Third, mainstream physicians and mainstream scientists were not dragged into support for Nazi ideology. Many of them were enthusiastic supporters. Some found an outlet in the party for their ideas and were promoted to positions of authority and power as a result. So to those who would say, well, the Holocaust does not speak to us, the Holocaust has little in common with us, the Holocaust doesn't touch my life, what do I as a scientist or a physician or an ethicist have to do with the madmen, the lunatic fringe, who are involved with the Nazi Party? I say that this is wrong because it cheapens the Holocaust and it is not accurate as to what took place. What took place involved mainstream people with mainstream support of ideas that came the mainstream. It involved the incorporation of scientific and medical theories into Nazi Party ideology, and as I said, it involved a symbiosis between the scientific and medical communities and the goals that they felt they had to serve and those of the German Reich. But it involved people who thought of themselves as competent, as qualified, as good, as decent. So that there are lessons that speak to us that we have to be aware of, not because we want to in any way exculpate the responsibility of those who promulgated the theories or in any way endorse or lend any dignity to the theories that were advanced of race hygiene and genetic inferiority. But we must realize where they come from, and we must try and understand the circumstances that allowed them to flourish. Let me turn next to a review of one other area that I haven't mentioned yet, but I think it's important that we have an overview of it so we know what we're talking about when we come back to this subject later in the conference, this evening with Professor Katz, and tomorrow in some of the deliberations, and that is experimentation conducted by physicians and scientists in the camps once they had gotten going full tilt. I've looked through all the trial transcripts from both the medical trials at Dachau and some of the satellite trials that were held, lesser trials as they're sometimes called. I've studied a number of books on the subject of the Holocaust, none of them by medical ethicists, but there are some books that have become available mainly actually in the past few years about the role of medicine and science in the Holocaust. And I've made up a list, which I won't read to you completely, of 28 different types of experiments that were conducted in the camps. They range from typhus vaccine trials and high-altitude decompression trials and experiments to make seawater drinkable and the hypothermia experiments and experiments to find cures for malaria, phosgene gas, mustard gas experiments, to horrible experiments where people are given wounds, women at the Ravensbrück concentration camp to simulate war injuries in order to see whether drugs will be effective in their cure. They're shot, they're cut with glass, the wounds are stuffed with infectious and dirty materials in order to simulate the battlefield, and the women are left night after night to scream in their bunks while pus pours out of these wounds, and then some are treated and some are not, using a fairly typical random clinical trial technique to assess the efficacy of different regimens that the physicians are hopeful will prove useful on the battlefield. The experiments include methods of how to effectively and efficiently kill people, what's the best way to do it, and anyone who doubts that mainstream science and medicine had to be involved in the Holocaust has not grappled with the daunting technical problems of trying to kill 20 million people efficiently, cheaply. And it took a lot of experimentation to come up with a method to do it. Phenol gas, injections to the heart, different types of shooting, and ultimately different forms of gassing. these experiments were carried out at different times in the camps. And those who had an interest in the racial hygiene theories also wanted to have data available and material available to prove their findings. And so many tissue samples, skulls, skeletons are sent to anthropological institutes in Germany and in occupied areas of France for study and examination. Extensive collections are established of abnormal brains of Jewish Bolshevik commissars, of gypsies, of people with schizophrenia, epileptics, in order to confirm the racial hygiene theories. There are extensive studies, too, of the effects of psychological fear on ovulation. Women are brought to camps, sent up to the shower rooms, told they're about to die, and then brought back to the bunks to see what happens to their menstrual cycle and their ovulatory period. And there are extensive studies as well done in the camps of twins, of dwarves, of people who have interesting phenotypic characteristics, and an extensive set of experiments conducted on how to effectively and efficiently sterilize people. The network of experimentation in the camps is large. The level of competence in carrying through these experiments is debatable, but there's no doubt that many of the people who did them were reputable, mainstream, university-affiliated scientists and physicians, that their credentials could not be questioned. When the research of the sort that I've described across the spectrum falls into the area of military interest and application, then the qualifications of those called upon to commit these tortures on innocent, involuntary victims goes up. When some people are left to their own devices in the camps, they concoct their own strange experiments and carry them out. One of the most repugnant that I've come across is the attempt by Mengele to change eye color, to see whether it would be possible to change brown eyes to blue using injections, because that would help Aryanize conquered peoples who had somehow lost some of their genetic purity through outbreeding with inferior races. You can't simply look at any of these experiments and say anything in common about them. They all have their own uniqueness and particularities as to why they were done, who did them, what they thought they were doing, why they were undertaken. And as I'll explain to you in a minute, the people who did them all had their own rationales for undertaking them, when some of them, although not all of them, were put on trial at the end of the war. Let me simply describe to you two particular sets of experiments, since I think they'll come up during the course of the next 2 days, so that we understand that we're talking about real people who were tortured and died. One set, the decompression studies done at Dachau from February to May 1942, using 200 subjects, resulting in at least 80 deaths. These were experiments in which prisoners were put into decompression chambers. The purpose was to figure out what altitude and barometric pressure men could survive under, because the Germans were keenly interested in perfecting the jet airplane. And they wanted to know how high pilots could fly without passing out or dying. They also wanted to know what the best means were for resuscitating people who'd suffered decompression injury. These experiments were carried out by Rascher, who we'll hear more about through the rest of this meeting, no doubt, Ruff, Romberg. They were carried out on criminals. They were carried out on Jews. The people who were in them were put into these chambers. The pressure was evacuated. They clawed at the walls. They tore at their hair. They tried to kill themselves. Some had their eyeballs blown out of their heads. Some lived. Some went back into the chamber a second time. The results of these decompression studies were presented many times at different meetings of the Luftwaffe Medical Society. And it's interesting to note that at least Ruff and Romberg as far as I've been able to tell, came to the United States at the end of the war to contribute to the American military effort to develop a space program. In the hypothermia experiments, the freezing experiments, these are conducted in 3 phases, August 1942 to May 1943. About 300 subjects used, but 400 experiments are reported to have been done. Some subjects were used more than once. Again, it's reported that were about 80 to 90 deaths. In the first phase of these experiments, August to October 1942, under the supervision of the Luftwaffe, Professors Hosenlohner and Fink are called from the University of Kiel to come to Dachau and work with Rascher, since he had done a good job with the decompression studies, by the Luftwaffe in order to conduct experiments in order to understand the effect of freezing cold on the human body. Cold water is mixed in vats, specially prepared with water and ice, and the subjects are placed in naked or in suits, specially designed protective suits. Some are given narcotics, some are not, and they too suffer terribly. They scream, they yell, they beg to be killed. The experiments are conducted. Approximately 15 to 18 people die out of the 50 to 60 prisoners who are subjected to this. It's interesting that the selection of the subjects in these experiments is based upon Nazi racial theory. Originally, it was proposed that Jews be used. They were rejected as not close enough to the German pilots and seamen who were supposed to be the beneficiaries of this. So eventually, non-German nationals, political dissidents, left-wing German political prisoners, and Soviet prisoners of war are brought in to conduct these trials as the subjects, because they're believed to be more racially analogous to the people who will be the beneficiaries of the findings as a result of their participation in the war. In the second phase, the so-called rewarming experiments of the hypothermia studies, hot baths and warming by the human body are proposed as possible ways to reheat victims of freezing. 4 female gypsies are brought to the camp to rewarm men who've been frozen to the point of unconsciousness. One is excused by Rascher. She looks too Aryan. She can't possibly be a gypsy. These experiments were done partly at the behest of Himmler himself, who wanted to know, would the human body heat be an effective source of rewarming people? And as many people have said, it was known long before that this was nonsense, and it's been known long since that this is nonsense. But this is done. In the Luftwaffe scientists returned back to Kiel, to the university, their work being done. Rascher decides to take advantage of the opportunity to continue this work and possibly get a PhD thesis by moving on to a third phase of cold exposure, which involves the more realistic simulation of freezing, standing outside naked, having cold water dumped on you in winter temperatures. And he begins those experiments, and I'll just conclude this review of what we're talking about when we talk about experiments by saying they had to stop them because the screaming was too disruptive for the camp. So he actually began to write to Himmler for a new location. No one could bear listening to this. And this is in the middle of a concentration camp, so it must have been some level of horror. The experiments that were done, we'll be debating why, how, what was said, defenses and rationales, and we'll be debating whether anyone ought to use any of the findings or information from these so-called experiments. We'll be debating whether there's any information there to be found from any of them, whether there's anything here that anyone could characterize as reliable or scientific. I simply want to say that we have to keep in mind the suffering of the victims, what it meant to have pus pouring out of your leg when you'd had it slit open and stuffed with some putrid agent, or what it meant to be frozen outside in a tank and scream all night long to the point where even in a concentration camp, no one could bear it. Those are the ghosts that we have to reckon with as we think about these questions of what to make of the data. That leads me to the next subject that I wanted to address, and this may be the most difficult of all in some ways, because it runs the greatest risk of appearing to exculpate or excuse what took place in terms of experimentation, genocide, euthanasia, torture, just on the available innocence. And I don't mean to excuse, but I think of all the issues that have to be grappled with, again, for my field of bioethics, the most obvious and yet the most neglected is, what did the doctors say about why they did what they did? If you were to look at the trial transcripts just from Nuremberg, from the medical cases, the 2 volumes of the Nuremberg trials, which are solely devoted to a review of the activities of doctors and public health persons in the years during the war, you'd find that these men did not go before the court and say, we were wrong, that few of them expressed any remorse, and that nearly all of them attempted to deliver arguments in defense of what they did. I don't want to commit the mistake that I said had troubled me so much over the years in terms of making a glib analogy to things that people say today about contemporary bioethics events and the arguments that might be made. But as I review for you what, in fact, some of the ethical arguments were, I would only ask you to think a little bit as to whether some of these defenses or rationales echo in things that you may have heard about what we ought to do with prisoners, or the mentally retarded, or people with AIDS, or defective newborns, or people with terminal illness. You see if some of these defenses, ethical defenses, and they were brought forward as such, ring true, sound familiar, resonate. And there are, at least as I can tease out of these testimonies and defenses, 11 different attempts at a defense on ethics grounds. Again, I don't endorse them. I simply think we have to see them. If we call ourselves or say that we are interested in medical ethics, then I think it's important that we know and have some ability to grapple with and attempt to correct and refute what these physicians said about their actions, their murders, their tortures. First, many could and were helped by the sacrifice of the few. That when you are in a situation where you can create great benefit for many by torturing or killing or sacrificing the few, it is ethically justifiable to do so. Second, scientists are not responsible for making value judgments. It's not their place. They're responsible for designing carefully crafted experiments. It's not their business to judge what experiments ought to be done or whether they should be done. Third, only the doomed were utilized in research. We only used people who were going to die anyway. Fourth, only prisoners were used in lethal research. We only used people who had been convicted or condemned as prisoners. Fifth, the research we did and the euthanasia activities that were carried out were critical for the welfare, safety, and overall public health of the state. The state had to engage in these activities to remove internal threats to its well-being. Sixth, the medical activities done were ordered by legitimate state authorities. We followed the orders of legitimate authority. 7, and a related argument, doctors cannot override legitimate requests and instructions from appropriate, legitimate government officials. 8th, the moral duties of physicians are different under conditions of total war. Probably the most eloquent exponent and the most difficult to grapple with, if you read his testimony at the Nuremberg trial, is Gerhard Rose. Gerhard Rose was the head of the Koch Institute of Tropical Medicine. He was the most distinguished expert in tropical diseases in the world. Gerhard Rose tried to find something that would cure typhus. And he ran what I would have to say, in my view, non-scientific view, but appears to me to be a fairly well-crafted random clinical trial to test out some vaccines that he thought might have efficacy against typhus. When Rose was in the docket at Nuremberg, he did not say, "I'm wrong, I regret what I did, it was madness." What he said was, in total war, physicians must do what they can to advance the interests of the state. If we were losing 5,000 men a day to typhus on the Eastern Front, what were the lives of 10 men in a camp? What were the lives of 10 against 10,000, 20,000, 100,000 of our soldiers? And I have to tell you that the prosecution at the trial has a very hard time responding to Gerhard Rose. But that's interesting and it's important because we had better be able to respond to Gerhard Rose today. The 10th argument that I've been able to tease out in reading through the transcripts, the Western nations engaged in similar activities and justified them in the name of state security and national interest. And it's interesting that the lawyers for the defendants of the medical trial were crafty, smart, and able, and they compiled a long record of experiments conducted by British, French, and American doctors in prisons, in jails, in Algeria, in India, at the Statesville prison in Illinois, in which people were put at life-threatening danger for medical purposes, vaccine development, for the purposes of trying to understand all manner of physiological diseases and disorders. And what the defense argued was, you're trying to pretend that in times of war, medicine has special rules, and they're not, and you know it because your own healthcare professions engaged in these very same activities and in similar sorts of experiments during the same period. And the last argument that is advanced is that there is no legal concept of crimes against humanity, that there is no such thing as the crime of genocide, and that the charge can't stick because it doesn't exist. And I have to tell you, if you look again at the trial transcripts very carefully, you will find that the prosecution half believes this. There is no international agreement and covenant about genocidal crimes at the time, and the prosecution has to struggle very hard to come up with a legal foundation for making the case against these physicians, not just for the experiments, but for the operation of the ovens, the selection of the people who would live and who would die, the selection of people to live in forced labor until they drop dead, and the operation of the crematoria, and the picking over of the remains of the things that they had burned and destroyed, the human beings that they viewed as objects. As far as I know, there are still nations in the world who have not signed the document that emerged after this trial concerning crimes against humanity and genocide. This one might be one of them that we're in, the United States. For many years we didn't sign that convention. And in fact, I think about a year ago we finally became a signatory. There are many other nations that still have not signed. As I read the trial transcripts, I came away with mixed feelings, torn in the way that Irv was describing, because I knew that some people would say, look, who cares what these people said? They're fighting for their lives. They're trying to come up with justifications for what they did. They're desperate. it's the nature of this setting that people will come up with arguments and rationales and defenses. But I don't believe it. And I think if you read the trial transcripts, you would feel that yes, sometimes there are rationalizations, and yes, there are people there who are trying to escape capital punishment or the noose. But when Gerhard Rose makes his defense, when other people rise to the defense of the state in terms of the threats that it faced from internal and external pestilences, plagues, bacteria, invasions of the disease of the Jew or the Gypsy or the Slav, that they believed that what they did had an ethical basis, that it was not done with an eye closed toward what is moral or ethical. For some of these scientists and physicians, they did what they did because they thought it was right. They thought it was justifiable. And that leads me to my last comments in trying to give you a framework of the involvement of science in medicine and trying to review with you some of the particular experiments that were carried out and trying to go through in a difficult, I hope difficult for you because it's difficult for me, review of these arguments. The obvious question becomes, so what do we say back to these 11 arguments? How do we want to respond? Is there any validity to any of them? Do we behave according to any of these principles? Are these rationales that only sound wrong if they're in the wrong mouths, or if you're standing next to the crematorium, or are they wrong in principle? And I only have 5 comments to make at this point. Maybe others will have more to say during the next 2 days about the assessment and critique of these medical ethics statements. The first thing I would say is that I think every medical student, every doctor, every nurse, every public health person should know what they are. And if medical ethics education and teaching and symposia and conferences don't do that, then it's a failure. If this conference is the first of its type in bioethics, as I think it is, then there ought to be more. To those of you who wrote or called and said, something's missing, add this, do more, extend the subjects, let me speak. What I say to you listening to these arguments is, the field has not done what it should, but there is more to do, because when the book has only been taken out 2 times in 50 years, when the literature doesn't exist, when there is no attempt to grapple in a careful manner, in an anguished manner, not only with the crimes, but with the defenses, then the field has not done what it must do. Second, it seems to me we must understand the inadequacy of utilitarianism. That most of the arguments presented are basically cost-benefit. They basically say, if there are vast rewards to be obtained with harm to a few, then we'll take the trade. And what, to some extent, we've attempted to do in medical ethics since this event, the events of the Holocaust, is to try and put some limits on utilitarianism. But unfortunately, particularly in the American context, utilitarianism in its pure, naked, unbridled cost-benefit form has many adherents. Thirdly, when we ask questions of what medicine and science should do in the service of the state, when people try to raise questions about involvement in military research or in activities concerning national security, we have to remember that these arguments have been presented in defense of heinous crimes, and that we still don't understand very well what the limits and responsibilities and duties and rights are of scientists and health professionals in dealing with matters of national security and state interest. It seems to me to be as open a question today as it was when the prosecutors were trying to figure out what to say in response to this defense at the Nuremberg trials of the doctors. It seems to me important to recognize 2 more things. The total inaccuracy of the defense that people are doomed. That if we say we can do something to a group of people we know are going to die, if we do something to people that we say are fated to expire, we are really robbing them of one of the last rights they have and one of the last areas of control they have, which is to control the circumstances and conditions of their dying. That it is not a situation that we can accept to say that people are bereft of rights because they're doomed to die, because that is precisely the argument that appears that people's rights evaporate the closer they get to certain death, whether it be man-made or natural. And that leads me to the last comment in trying to assess and think about what was said in defense of these crimes and horrors and tortures. That when people remark and when people comment upon the idea that doctors and nurses and public health officials should not be above morality, they have to keep in mind that doctors and public health officials and nurses and social workers and physical therapists, psychologists, psychiatrists also must do more than ordinary morality. It is not an acceptable defense, in my view, to say that someone is doomed if you still have the power to change or affect that fatal outcome. It is not enough to say, I'm just following the tenets of ordinary morality, which is what basically is said by the doctors on trial at Nuremberg, that we did what ordinary morality demanded of us. What that means to me is that we have to think more carefully about why it is and what it should be that constitutes extraordinary morality, where science and medicine are involved. It may not be enough to rise to the level of ordinary morality. It may be important to set the bar higher where activities of medicine and science are concerned. But I hope I provided you with a framework that disturbs you. I hope I've made you understand a little bit about some of the factors and variables that have been on my mind in thinking about this conference. I'm hoping that as we move through the next few days, we'll be able in some small way to rectify the omission of discussion of the role played by science and medicine in these events. I hope that some people might take issue. I hope that some people might advance the debate beyond where I've taken it. But the fact that it's finally taking place, I hope, will be as rewarding to you as it is to me. Thank you.
If you have questions written out, could you please hold them up? Someone will pass through now and collect them, and we'll start the question and answer session. Perhaps while that's going on, even though Art has just taken his seat, I can pose one of the questions that was posed to us during the presentation, and that was to think about some of the current situations that echo or reflect some of those justifications that were made at the Nuremberg trial. And I guess I would ask Art if he would perhaps make some of those connections that he sees.
I'll give you two examples where I think that I can remember in recent times where someone has said to me something that, having looked through the medical trials and the defenses and arguments that were given, made me feel an eerie presence of those who attempted to explain why they had done the crimes they had done some 45 years ago. Not so long ago, and it happens every once in a while, someone says to me, we have capital punishment in the United States and many states. Why is it that we do not use prisoners as organ donors? And why don't we kill them in such a fashion that we could obtain their vital organs and tissues to benefit others? After all, these are people who have done great harm. The least they can do is pay back with their bodies for some of what they have done. And I hear the argument, and I know what's being said. I understand the case that's being made about can't the state ask this, and can't that kind of punishment be reasonable relative to someone who's committed a capital crime? But I think to myself, this is precisely the road that some of the doctors who engaged in lethal experiments believed in when they were administering their experiments in some of these camps, that they thought prisoners lose their rights, prisoners have no control or say over what will be done with their bodies or persons while they're on the road or the path to the means of their death. And it seems to me that kind of analogy, sometimes said jokingly, sometimes said in great earnest, is disturbing. The other analogy that I find myself listening to, and I hear people commenting on it, but not publicly, is in references to the following sort. AIDS is a Holocaust for the gay community. Abortion is a Holocaust for tens of thousands, actually millions of fetuses around the world. And I think to myself, when I hear that sort of metaphor analogy, it's not appropriate because whatever is going on in the dispute and arguments about abortion, the Holocaust represents the intentional killing of human beings because of their supposed inferiority, because of their supposed racial and genetic impurity, because they are viewed as threats to the state, because they are seen as parasites in a public health model, corrupting, eating away at, coring out the stability of the Reich. So that it's not enough to talk about killings, and I think I understand a little bit why some people shudder when they hear that analogy made, because in some sense, the kind of crimes and the kinds of defenses that I was reviewing here of those crimes are different. It's not the killing that is in common. It undermines and underplays the specific rationale, purpose, and ideology that fueled the genocidal activities of the Holocaust. So those are some of the ways in which I find myself thinking these arguments of today, which bandy about the events of the past and the crimes of the past, are not being thought through carefully.
We have a number of questions here. I'm going to give you a fairly easy one now. Would you like to sit down and have me stand up?
Okay.
You had 11 defenses. You omitted number 10. What was it?
Well, what was the 10th defense? Gosh. Well, ask me another question, and I'll look it up here.
Okay. Number 9 we're looking for. All right, this is a fairly extensive question. As both a research scientist and a philosopher bioethicist, I see a parallel between the misuse of professional expertise of physicians and scientists in determining Nazi governmental policies and the present-day potential misuse of professional expertise of philosophers, ethicists, and bioethicists in helping to formulate and determine U.S. governmental public policy. Might this observation comprise one of the meanings of the Holocaust for bioethics? I'd like to hear your opinion. I'll give you the question.
Well, this particular question is asking about how should people in bioethics or ethics use their expertise, and I gather to some extent their position or authority or whatever society tends to put American society in an event in pronouncements of ethics experts with respect to public policy. I don't know what I think about the meaning of the Holocaust relative to the question of the responsibilities of bioethicists per se. I think it's a very important question. I think the one thing that comes to my mind in reviewing the ethics arguments at the medical trials, now just talking about the Nuremberg trials, not the satellite ones, but at the major trials, so to speak, and from my list, it seems to me that it's important to realize that not only can people find rationales couched in ethical language, they can believe them, and if ethicists or bioethicists or those who are experts and are alleged to have expertise aren't open and willing to put their views to challenge, to criticism, it's the insularity in some ways of the medical and scientific community's defense that strikes me. It does seem to me that you can't have a profession of bioethicists. What you should have in medical ethics or bioethics is a group of people who put out opinions, and the public debates them, and the public argues about them, and there they go. And the public takes them with a grain of salt, depending upon how. But if you allow an insularity and a kind of formal ideology to become rooted, only the experts will speak on ethics, that can have a pernicious effect, because I think to some extent that's exactly what happened with respect to the medical ethic that predominated prior to and during the Nazi era. And I still can't find number 9.
Okay.
And I'll keep looking.
All right, I'll ask another factual question. Is there any documentation of any repercussions taken against medical professionals who refuse to participate in such experimentation?
There isn't an extensive literature on what happened to doctors and people who did not go along with orders or directives or policies that involve torture, murder, and genocide. However, we do know that in the late 1930s, when euthanasia was being extended into the mental hospitals, was being extended toward handicapped newborns, and was being extended toward the feeble elderly, that there were physicians who said they did not want to get involved in the euthanasia program, and they were not punished. Others were found to take their place, but no jailings or extraordinary measures took place. Robert J. Lifton, in his book of interviews with doctors at the camps, does interview 1 or 2 physicians who said they did not want to engage in the process of what was called selection at the camp gate, who would live and who would die. You have to keep in mind that Nazi policy was that physicians had to make the selections of who would live and who would die, the triage at every camp, and later Hitler extended that to involve physicians who were trained in anthropology. Only they could make the selections. Only they were qualified. There were
Good afternoon. Thus far in the conference, there have been several discussions on the advantages and disadvantages, implications and impacts of using scientific data gathered from Nazi experimentation. This afternoon, we will have 2 presentations followed by discussion, which will focus on the question, how could the scientific community support and participate in the race hygiene policies? Were they victims or engineers of this movement? Our first presentation will be given by Dr. Robert Proctor, who is chair of the program Science, Technology, and Power at the Lang College of the New School of Social Research. He is the author of a recently published book, Racial Hygiene, Medicine Under the Nazis, which I understand has been reviewed widely and positively. He will discuss the interface and eventually the intertwinings of social politics and medical science as it occurred in Nazi Germany. The result, a politicization of medical science, and even more frightening, the medicalization of political and social designs. His paper, Nazi Biomedical Policies. Dr. Proctor?
Thank you. the way I understand our general task of this meeting is really to talk about forms of continuity and discontinuity, lessons for the present, and so forth. My task is primarily an historical one, to look at the historical record, what happened in the name of racial hygiene and medicine in Germany in the Nazi period. I'm interested in three kinds of continuity, actually. Continuity of the past with the present, but also of the past with a prior past, that is to say the continuities that exist between the Nazi period and the period prior to the Nazi period, and also what might be called an international continuity during the Nazi period, that is the frightening continuity one finds in certain forms of research and policy in other states at the same time of the Nazi regime. The general argument I want to make here is one that today, in the context of our conference here, sounds almost familiar or commonplace, but that 8 or 10 years ago actually sounded to many people, I think, more radical. And that's that biomedical scientists played an active and leading role in the initiation, the administration, and the execution of each of the major Nazi racial programs. In this sense, I want to argue that science, and especially biomedical science, under the Nazis cannot be seen simply in terms of an essentially passive or apolitical scientific community responding to external political forces. In fact, political initiatives arose from within the scientific community, and science and technology were integral parts of the Nazi program. But I also want to argue that it's wrong to focus on science or technology exclusively or per se as the guilty party in Nazi crime. The technologies used by Nazi ideologues were shaped by political priorities, and nothing inherent in the instrumental logic of science or the technological process brought about these crimes. Nazi science represents the triumph of a particular kind of science, but not of science in general. In fact, it was ultimately a political movement, the seizure of state power by the Nazi Party, that allowed forces hostile to life and liberty to be unleashed within the scientific community. Well, let me say a few words about what was known as racial hygiene, roughly translatable as eugenics. At the end of the 19th century, German social Darwinists, fearing a general degeneration of the human race, set about to establish a new kind of hygiene, what they called a Rassenhygiene, a racial hygiene, that would reorient medicine away from looking simply at the individual to looking at the germplasm. In fact, in the eyes of its founders, the racial hygiene movement was really to complement two other types of medicine. It was to complement traditional medicine or personal hygiene. It was also to complement public hygiene or social hygiene. And these three prongs of medicine were going to provide the new type of medicine. You would have personal hygiene, social hygiene, what we would call public health, and racial hygiene, which was care for the future of the human germplasm. Racial hygienists, in this sense, were really trying to provide what might be called a preventive medicine. They were going to prevent diseases in the German population by combating the disproportionate breeding of inferiors, the celibacy of the upper classes, and the threat posed by feminists to the reproductive performance of the family. And I actually wanted to start with a few slides illustrating some of the concerns of the racial hygienists. This is a chart from one of the leading racial hygiene journals, Folk and Race, and it's illustrating the concern that many racial hygienists had that the birth rate was declining here. The death rate is also declining, but the birth rate is declining more rapidly. And they're worried about this difference here, the difference between the birth rate and the death rate, which is the population growth rate, that this difference here is going to decline. And this is the rate of marriages here. This shows another concern on the part of the early racial hygienists. They're worried about the disproportionate breeding of so-called inferiors. Here they're saying today only criminals are breeding in the present German Reich, and they're saying male criminals have an average of 4.9 children, parents of slow-learning children, 3.5 children, the German sort of family here with only 2.2 children per marriage, and a marriage from the educated classes with the man with this military smoking jacket here, only having 1.9 children. So this is one of the persistent themes of the racial hygienists. Another theme, they're worried about the disproportionate breeding of other nations. They're worried about the Asian menace, the Russian menace, and so forth. They're projecting here that from 1810 to 1960, you're going to see a growth of the Slavic population here, swamping out the Germanic and the Latin population here. They're especially worried about the Ukrainian birth rate and so forth. Another theme they were worried about, which sometimes you even hear about today, is the increasing aging of the population. They're worried about the proportion of the aged growing up to nearly 10% of the population by the 1970s. So these were some of the common themes. One interesting thing that I found was that the early racial hygiene movement is not primarily anti-Semitic. Its concerns are more nationalistic, what might be called meritocratic. They're not even that concerned early on about Nordic supremacy. The eugenicists worried more about the indiscriminate use of birth control by the fit, about the provision of inexpensive medical care to the unfit, than about the breeding of superior with inferior races or other themes that we associate with the Nazis. Anti-Semitism plays a relatively minor role in the early racial hygiene movement. In fact, the founder of the racial hygiene movement in Germany, Alfred Plutz, considered that Jews were actually to be classified along with Nordics as one of the superior cultured races of the world. I should also note that there was a Jewish racial hygiene movement for which a number of rabbis wrote, and there's some interesting work being done on this now at the present at Columbia. By the mid-1920s, however, this situation has changed, and you get a dramatically different character of the racial hygiene movement. The racial hygiene movement starts to merge with the young National Socialist movement. In the early 1920s, the conservative anti-Semitic J.F. Lehman publishing house takes over publication of the leading journal of racial hygiene. And in fact, ideologies also, Nazi ideologists at this time also start appealing to racial hygiene as being really a centerpiece of their own discourse. Now, traditionally, historians and philosophers often talk about the romantic origins of National Socialism, the links with German idealism or the nihilism of Nietzsche, the Aryan supremacy of Gobineau or Chamberlain and Lapouge and so forth. But what has really been relatively ignored until recently is the importance of biology and biological discourse in Nazi ideology, especially what might be called biologism or biological determinism. Let me give a couple of examples of this. Fritz Lenz, for example, one of the most prominent racial hygienists in the interwar period and the Nazi period, praised Hitler in 1930 as the first politician of truly great import who has taken racial hygiene as a serious element of state policy. Hitler himself was lauded as the doctor of the German people, and I have sort of an illegible slide here in this light. Anyway, it says, this is from a popular health journal, which says Adolf Hitler as the doctor of the German people, and underneath this is a text about the importance of society being a biological entity, meaning by this really what we would translate as an organic entity. One part of society was not supposed to attack another. Hitler himself called his revolution the final step in the overcoming of historicism and the recognition of purely biological values. There are a couple examples of this I wanted to show further. This is from the leading theoretical journal of the SS, and here they're contrasting Auslese, or selection, showing members of the SS here, with counter-selection here. And this is part of the propaganda effort which gets underway in the early 30s to instill a kind of hatred and fear of the mentally disabled, the physically handicapped, and so forth. This biological character of the Nazi regime has another dimension to it, and that's that the Nazis were interested in promoting what they called a natural mode of living. Women, for example, were not supposed to wear makeup, and legislation was enacted to protect endangered species. Hitler, as some of you may know, was a vegetarian and did not smoke or drink, and one of the most powerful physicians in the Nazi period once declared the Nazi state to be the most organic state in the world. Related to this general support for biology and biological determinism is the disturbing fact that doctors were among those most strongly attracted to the Nazi movement. In 1929, a number of physicians formed the National Socialist Physicians League to coordinate Nazi medical policy and purify the German medical community of what was called Jewish Bolshevism. The Nazi Medical League was an immediate success, with about 3,000 physicians, representing 6% of the entire profession, joining the Nazi League by January 1933, that is before the rise of Hitler, so 3,000 physicians in the Nazi Party before the rise of Hitler. Doctors, in fact, joined the Nazi Party earlier and in greater numbers than any other professional group, and I think this is something that we have to reflect on. By 1942, more than 38,000 doctors had joined the Nazi Party, representing about half of all doctors in the country. In 1937, doctors were represented in the SS 7 times more often than was average for the employed male population. Doctors assumed leading positions in German government and universities. Well, now you often hear, sort of when you think about science and the Nazis, you hear about science being suppressed by the Nazis. Some emigres said, well, by 1933 you really had no choice but to flee the country or else cooperate. And there's certainly some truth in this, but I think it misses the more important point that medical scientists were among those who invent racial hygiene in the first place. Many of the 20-odd institutes for racial hygiene were established before 1933, and in fact by 1932 racial hygiene has really become an orthodoxy of the German medical community. 2 of the leading institutes in this regard were both affiliates of the Kaiser Wilhelm Gesellschaft, the Rudin Institute, Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Psychiatry and Genealogy in Munich, and the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Anthropology, Human Genetics and Eugenics in Berlin. Just to give you a kind of sense of some of the research that went on, racial hygienists at this time were very interested in distinguishing nature and nurture, involved in looking at identical twins raised apart. In fact, twin research becomes so important for the Nazis that they passed a law requiring that every twin born in the Reich be registered with state authorities for purposes of genetic research. The largest institute was Ottmar von Verschuer's Frankfurt Institute for Racial Hygiene, with 67 rooms and several laboratories. This is where Joseph Mengele did his doctoral research on cleft palate, and this is also where, as we've heard from other speakers, Mengele was appointed assistant to Verschuer and provided so-called experimental materials to the institute, including eyes and other body parts from Auschwitz, as part of a study funded by the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft. Scientists, in other words, were not simply pawns in the hands of Nazi officials, but without a strong state to back them, racial hygiene was relatively impotent. It was not until 1933, in the triumph of Hitler's fascism, that the programs of the pre-Nazi period gained the support of officials willing to move aggressively in this area. And there are 3 areas I want to look at briefly of applied, what might be called applied racial hygiene: the sterilization law, the Nuremberg laws, and then the euthanasia operation. On July 14th, 1933, the Nazi government passed the first major triumph of racial hygiene. This was the sterilization law, the law for the prevention of genetically diseased offspring. This law allowed the sterilization of anyone suffering from supposedly genetically determined illnesses, including feeble-mindedness, schizophrenia, manic depression, genetic epilepsy, Huntington's chorea, genetic blindness, deafness, or severe alcoholism. In 1934, 181 genetic health courts and supreme genetic health courts were established throughout Germany to adjudicate these laws. And these laws were established, and basically there were 2 physicians and a lawyer were running these institutions. Doctors were required to register every case of genetic illness known to them, and if you were a physician, you could be fined 150 Reichsmarks for failing to register a genetic defective with government authorities. At this same time, the official West German Medical Association began a journal called Der Erbarzt, the genetic doctor, to help physicians determine who should be sterilized. And basically physicians would write in and say, well, I have a patient with a club foot, Does this patient have to be sterilized? Or even sometimes non-physicians would write in, they say, well, my son is a Down syndrome child, does this mean that he must be sterilized? And there would be expert opinions given on this. Estimates of the total number of people sterilized range from about 350,000 to 400,000, and you should realize that this was about 1% of the population in some areas of Germany. Some racial hygienists wanted to push this even further and argued that there should be as many as 10% of the entire population sterilized. One of our themes, as I've already noted, is continuity, and I want to stress that the American sterilization laws provided a kind of model for German sterilization laws in this period. And in fact, if you look at each of the Nazi racial programs, you find disturbingly kinds of resonances with other forms of policy in other countries of Europe. By the late 1920s, in the United States, 15,000 individuals had been sterilized in the United States, most of these while incarcerated in prisons or homes for the mentally ill. About half of these took place in California, the rest of these in northern states of the United States. German racial hygienists throughout the Weimar period, prior to the Nazi regime, expressed their envy of American achievements in this area, warning that unless the Germans made progress, America would become the world racial leader. And I wanted to illustrate this. Let me show you, first of all, a couple of slides. These are on the, this is the official journal of the Nazi Medical League, and it's called Golden Path, Journal of the National Socialist Physicians League, and it says we're taking over the leadership here. The previous slide here, which I passed over, this is the top Nazi doctor up till 1939. I chose this sort of serene-looking picture of him in order to stress really the what I thought was a more frightening aspect of doctors in this period. They're not simply they don't look like fanatics always. There are other pictures of him giving the Nazi salute, but I chose the one to make him look more like your next-door neighbor. This is a chart of the courses taught in racial hygiene and genetics and anthropology from 1900 up to 1937. And the only point I want to make from this is that the number of courses in racial hygiene grow, and most of the growth is before Hitler takes power. Hitler takes power here in 1933, and by this time the number of racial hygiene courses is already quite high in medical universities. It actually drops off slightly here, I think partially as a result of some racial hygienists moving in outside the university and into government positions. But the courses in genetics continue on until the later 70s, continue their growth. This is these are some of the official journals of racial hygiene. This is a journal of racial and sociobiology, including racial hygiene. This is the Journal of Racial Physiology, founded by Dr. Otto Recha, who was the also founder of the German Society for Blood Group Research, and a man who said he founded the Society for Blood Group Research in order to find out if you could distinguish Aryans and Jews in the test tube. He also went on to win, he becomes a top member of the SS and wins Austria's most prestigious science award after the war. This is the Journal of Racial Science, an international journal, begins in the Nazi period. This is Journal of Criminal Biology and Legal Reform, published by the J.F. Lehmann Verlag again. Down here's the cartouche. And this is the Journal of Genetic Pathology and Racial Hygiene, with an article here by Ritter, who, as Benner Miller-Hill showed, was one of the architects of the annihilation of the gypsies. Here he's got an article in the 1939 edition on the gypsy question and the gypsy bastard or gypsy half-breed question, right as he's beginning really to plan the roundup of these groups. Here's a Journal of Political Biology, and this is a chart from a public health magazine showing this is the law for the prevention of genetically diseased offspring, the sterilization law, with a map of Germany behind them. And it says we do not stand alone. In these other countries there are similar sterilization laws, though of course Germans were by far the most thorough in their carrying out of these laws. Well, racial medicine and the elimination of the weak and unproductive were not the only forms of oppression under the Nazi regime, and I think it's important in a conference like this to recall this. One aspect of Nazi ideology that is coming under increasing scrutiny in recent years is the masculine and machismo nature of that ideology. Of the 2.5 million members of the Nazi Party in 1935, only about 5% were women, and women were explicitly barred from top positions in the Nazi ranks very early on in the 1920s. Nazi medical philosophers were quite explicit about their feelings on this matter. A 1933 editorial of the Journal of the Nazi Physicians League announced that the National Socialist movement was, and I quote, the most masculine movement to have emerged in centuries. One of the initial thrusts of Nazi policy was to take women out of the workplace and to return them to the home, where they were supposed to have as many children as possible. Fritz Lenz, for example, argued that any woman with fewer than 15 babies by menopause should be considered pathological. The Nazi government itself was a little bit more modest on this, pushing what it called the four-child family ideal. On December 16, 1938, Hitler announced the establishment of the Iron Cross of German Motherhood, awarded in bronze for 4 children, silver for 6, and gold for 8. After 1938, all public officials, including professors, were required to marry or else resign, and medical journals published the names of unmarried or childless colleagues. I should also note that the population policy in this regard was remarkably successful. Within 1 year, the birth rate in Germany jumped from 14.7 per thousand to 18 per thousand, representing what one demographer called an unprecedented achievement in world population history and a victory in the war of births. There's about a 20% rise in the birth rate over 1 year, primarily due not to Nazi policies, but simply, I think, to the overwhelming optimism on the part of the German people with the triumph of Hitler. Well, at the same time that forced sterilization and abortion were instituted for individuals of inferior genetic stock, sterilization and abortion for so-called healthy German women were declared illegal. I think this is an important message to recall. The Nazis declared abortion a crime against the German body, and in fact they were able to declare anyone found committing an abortion guilty sometimes of treason and actually punishable by death during the war period. Access to birth control in all forms was also severely curtailed, except of course for Jews, for whom birth control and even abortion were generally available and, as you might imagine, encouraged. It's not well known, but there's one final aspect of this general question of gender that I wanted to mention. And that's that in Germany in 1939 there were substantially more Jewish women in Germany than Jewish men. In fact, the ratio was about 14 women for every 10 men, and men had presumably managed to emigrate in greater numbers. Historians have largely ignored the fact that among German Jews killed in concentration camps, including most of the 167,000 Jews living in Germany in 1941, about 60% were women. Women also outnumbered men among the gypsies killed at Auschwitz. Well, the second measure I want to talk about in terms of practical were the Nuremberg laws, but I really want to talk about it really quite briefly. In 1935, laws were passed excluding Jews from citizenship, preventing marriage or sexual relations between Jews and non-Jews, and finally also the so-called marital health laws requiring couples to submit to medical examination, basically through what were eventually called genetic counseling centers, to see if racial pollution might be involved. The only really point I want to make about the Nuremberg laws is something which is, I don't think, sufficiently recognized, is that these were considered public health measures. They were registered in the official registry of public health legislation, and they were administered in significant part by physicians, especially through these marital counseling centers or through these genetic counseling centers that were attached to local public health offices. The Nuremberg laws, along with the sterilization laws, were actually two of the primary reasons expenditures and personnel for public health actually expand under the Nazi period. As with the sterilization law, here too, German racial theorists learned from the Americans. In 1932, Bavarian health inspector Walter Schulze noted that the U.S. must be regarded as a nation where racial policy and thinking have become much more popular than in other countries. I should note that the other country that was commonly referred to was South Africa in terms of racial policy at this time as a model worth emulating. Schulze was referring not just to sterilization laws, but to the American immigration restriction laws, especially the 1924 Immigration Restriction Act, passed with the help of American eugenicists, which reduced the annual immigration into this country from 500,000 per year down to only 25,000 per year. In other words, cut it by 95%. In subsequent years, racial hygienists looked to other aspects of American policy for instruction. On more than one case, Nazi physicians argued that German racial policies were actually relatively liberal compared with the ways blacks were treated in the United States. Evidence for this was usually taken from the fact that in several southern states, a person with 1/32 black ancestry, 1 part in 32, was legally black, whereas if someone was 1/8 Jewish in Germany, and for many purposes only 1/4 Jewish, you were actually considered legally Aryan. Nazi physicians spent a great deal of time discussing American racial legislation. German medical journals reproduced charts showing the states in which blacks could or could not marry whites, could or could not vote, and so forth. And I've reproduced one of the charts here showing, this is actually from an American eugenics journal, and it's reproduced in a German eugenics journal, saying that in these dark states, American blacks are not allowed to marry whites, and they also have no voting rights, which is basically the same criterion for Jews in Germany at this time, and in the other states, various other types of racial apartheid legislation or segregation legislation. In 1939, Germany's leading racial hygiene journal reported that the University of Missouri had refused to admit black students. The same year, the journal reported the recent refusal of the American Medical Association to admit black physicians to its membership. In 1939, 5,000 black physicians petitioned the American Medical Association to join that segregated body at that time, and American physicians turned them down. And Nazi physicians were able to simply look at this and say, well, this is just what we're doing. If Americans don't allow blacks in their medical association, why should we allow Jews in ours? And in fact, it's the very same period that Jews are banned from practice of medicine. Third, the euthanasia program. There's been more discussion about this at this conference, so some of what I'll say is you've already heard a little bit about. In 1939, Hitler issues orders that certain doctors should be commissioned to grant a mercy death, was the language, to patients judged incurably sick by medical examination. By August 1941, when the operation was largely brought to a close, some 70,000 patients, as we've already heard, exactly 70,273, had been killed in an operation which provided the stage rehearsal for the subsequent genocide of Jews, homosexuals, communists, gypsies, Slavs, and prisoners of war. As we've also heard, the idea of destruction of lives not worth living did not begin with the Nazis, but in fact had been discussed in legal and medical literature long before the Nazi rise to power, and not just in Germany. A student of mine started doing an investigation of the euthanasia question in the United States in the late 1930s, and I suggested to her that probably you would expect to find between 1935 and 1942 the strongest support for a euthanasia movement in this country, and this is actually what she found. She found some rather dramatic things. In 1935, for example, the French-American Nobel Prize winner Alexis Carrel suggested in his book, Man the Unknown, that the criminal and mentally ill should be, quote, humanely and economically disposed of in small euthanasia institutions supplied with proper gases. Okay, this is 1935 by an American Nobel Prize winner. 6 years later, as German psychiatrists were sending the last of their patients into the gas chambers, an article appeared in the Journal of the American Psychiatric Association calling for the killing of retarded children. And the question was, what age should this occur at? Age 12 or age 15 and so forth. The fundamental argument for euthanasia at this time was economic. Euthanasia was justified as a kind of preemptive triage to free up beds, and this became especially important in wartime, and I really want to stress this, that things can happen in times of war that would not be tolerated by anyone, I think, under peacetime. And in fact, the euthanasia operation was consciously timed to coincide with the invasion of Poland. The first gassings of mental patients occurred at Posen in Poland on October 15th, 1939, just 45 days before the invasion, just 45 days after the invasion of that country, marking the beginning of the Second World War. In Germany itself, after the end of the first phase of euthanasia in August 1941, euthanasia becomes part of the normal hospital routine of literally dozens of German hospitals. Handicapped infants are regularly put to death, and persons requiring long-term psychiatric care and judged incurable suffer a similar fate. One other point on this context of war, and that is that one should recall that during the First World War, half of all German mental patients starved to death. 45,000 in Prussia alone, according to one estimate. They were simply too low on the list to receive rations. In the Nazi period, the starvation of the mentally ill, the homeless, and other useless eaters became official state policy after a prolonged propaganda campaign to stigmatize the mentally ill and handicapped as so-called lives not worth living. And basically the Nazis recognized what had happened in World War I with the blockade of German ports by British ships, and they said, well, we should just simply make systematic what was done in a kind of unsystematic fashion in the First World War. Okay. It's also important to appreciate both the banality and the popularity of the euthanasia program. In 1941, for example, the psychiatric institution at Hadamar celebrated the cremation of its 10,000th patient in a special ceremony where everyone in attendance, including secretaries, nurses, and psychiatrists, received a bottle of beer for the occasion. Historians exploring the origins of the Nazi destruction of lives not worth living have only in recent years begun to stress the link between the euthanasia operation on the one hand and the final solution on the other, and yet the two programs were linked in both theory and practice. The so-called Jewish question was commonly cast as a public health problem during the Nazi period, and in fact the official journal of the German Medical Association, the Deutsches Ärzteblatt, published in the 1940s a regular column during the war years called Solving the Jewish Problem, and they would sort of review solutions of the Jewish problem in Romania, solutions to the Jewish problem in France, and so forth. In the course of the late 1930s, German scientists proposed a number of different solutions to the so-called Jewish question. Some proposed sterilization of the Jews and so forth. The ultimate decision to gas the Jews emerged from the fact that the technical apparatus already existed for the destruction of the mentally ill. In the fall of 1941, with the completion of the bulk of the euthanasia operation, the gas chambers at psychiatric hospitals were dismantled and shipped east, where they were reinstalled at Majdanek, Auschwitz, and Treblinka. The same doctors, technicians, and nurses often followed the equipment east. In this sense, there was a continuity in both theory and practice between the destruction of lives not worth living in Germany's mental hospitals and the destruction of Germany's ethnic and social minorities. Well, most leading German physicians supported the Nazis. Well, why was this? Physicians commonly boasted, and they could rightly do so, that their profession had shown its allegiance earlier and in greater strength than any other professional group. But why was this the case? Well, first of all, we should recall that the medical profession at this time was quite conservative. Not all of physicians, of course, were conservative in this period. The profession is actually politicized in the wake of the economic collapse, defeat of Germany in the First World War, and especially in the economic collapse of 1929 through 1933. Physicians moved at this time from the center to the left and the right. Even though this occurred, the socialists and the communists were always in a relative minority in the German medical community. By the end of 1932, the Nazi Physicians League, for example, was twice as large as the Association of Socialist Physicians, with about 3,000 members as opposed to 1,500 members for the socialists and communist physicians. Apart from this conservatism, I would even argue there was a kind of ideological affinity at this time between medicine and Nazism. Many physicians were attracted by the importance given to race in the Nazi view of the world. Race was a medical concept, and in fact physicians were intrigued by the Nazi effort to biologize or medicalize a broad range of social problems, including crime, the falling birth rate, collapse of German imperial strength, or the Gypsy and Jewish problems. The Nazis were also able to exploit both the intimacy and the authority of the traditional patient-physician relationship. Crudely put, you could do things with doctors that would have been much harder without doctors. People have already mentioned at this conference the fact that in 1943, physicians were declared to be the ones who really were responsible for performing selections on the ramps. The rise of National Socialism also coincides with a period of concern about what was widely known as the crisis in modern medicine, a crisis associated with specialization or bureaucratization of medicine, a crisis traced sometimes to urbanization, to capitalism, to Bolshevism, materialism, or any of a host of other real or apparent threats to human health and well-being. In such a climate, Jews became a convenient scapegoat for all that was wrong in modern medicine, and this became especially easy because, as the Nazis were always wanting to remind people, Jews were in fact quite prominent in the German medical profession. 60% of Berlin's physicians, for example, in 1933 were either Jewish or of Jewish ancestry. Jews were blamed for the bureaucratization of medicine. Jews were accused of transforming medicine from a calling into a trade, and so forth. In fact, anything that one wanted to consider wrong with medicine, you could simply say, well, the Jews are causing it. In a certain perverse sense, the medical profession might even be said to have prospered under the Nazis. In terms of both personnel and funding, the German medical community is enlarged under the Nazis. It may even be true that the physicians achieved a higher status in the Nazi period than any time before or since. During the 12 years of Nazi rule, for example, the office of president at German universities was occupied by physicians 30% of the time, contrasting with 19% of the time for the decades prior to the Nazi period and 18% for the decades following the Nazi period. Doctors prospered financially under the Nazis. In 1926, lawyers earned an average salary of 18,000 Reichsmarks, compared with only 12,000 for physicians. By 1936, doctors had completely reversed this and now earned 2,000 Reichsmarks per year more than lawyers. The Nazis, in fact, supported many areas of the sciences, especially the applied and engineering sciences. In medicine, it's a chilling experience to watch the continuous publication of medical journals from 1932 to 1934. There's no break in the medical publication. There's no exodus from the medical journals. Medical journals did not close their doors. In fact, if you go to the New York Academy of Medicine or Stanford's Lane Library, or in fact any other major medical library, you can find more than 150 German medical journals published continuously through the Nazi period. These are technical medical journals. More than 100 meters of shelf space of journals, medical journals, more than any other country in the world at this time. In fact, some 30-odd new medical journals began publishing during the Nazi period, and many of these are still published today. Biomedical science was not, in other words, simply destroyed by the Nazis. The story is more complex. The Nazis supported extensive research into ecology, public health, carcinogenesis, human genetics, criminal biology, and of course, racial science as well. The Nazi government funded elaborate research on the effects of exposure to X-rays and heavy metals. Some of the first reliable studies of the health effects of asbestos were done in this period, and in fact, in 1939, the Nazi government is the first country in the world to recognize mesothelioma as a compensatable asbestos-induced disease. The Nazis were the first to initiate bans on smoking in public buildings. Nazi leaders organized massive support for midwifery, homeopathy, and a number of other areas of heterodox medicine. Nazi physicians recognized the importance of a diet high in fruit and fiber. The Nazis passed a law requiring every German bakery to produce whole grain bread, for example. Nazi physicians restricted the use of DDT and denied women tobacco rationing coupons on the grounds that nicotine could harm the fetus. And Nazi physicians supervised the largest revival of midwifery that probably the world has ever known. I've stressed the continuity with pre-1930 traditions, and it's really not my task here to discuss the important post-war continuities. Let me simply note in conclusion three summary points. First, it's important to appreciate not just the extent to which the Nazis were able to draw upon the imagery and authority of science, but also the extent to which Nazi ideology informed the actual practice of science and of medicine. Scientists were not simply bystanders or even pawns. The disturbing fact is that many, not all, but not a few, helped to construct the racial policies of the Nazi state. In fact, it's probably as fair to say that Nazi racial policy emerged from within the scientific and medical community as to say that it was imposed upon that scientific community. Secondly, it's commonly said that the Nazis politicized science, and that much of what went wrong under the Nazis can be traced to this politicization. The argument I've made here is that one can't simply consider the experience of the medical profession in terms of a simple use and abuse model of science. Among physicians, there were as many volunteers as there were victims. no one had to force physicians to support the regime. Heffelman testified to this effect in the euthanasia trial at Limburg in 1964, when he said that no doctor was ever ordered to participate in the euthanasia program. They came of their own volition. The Nazis did not have to politicize science. In fact, it's probably fair to say that in certain senses the Nazis depoliticized science, in the sense that they destroyed in science some of the political diversity and moral diversity that makes the politics of science or of medicine or of technology socially responsible. The Nazis destroyed a vigorous socialist medical tradition, for example, that had transformed Weimar medical practice, establishing local outpatient clinics, self-help networks, and so forth. In fact, the Nazis denounced the political as a category of discussion, transforming problems of what probably could be considered politics, problems of racial, sexual, or social deviance, into medical problems and ideally surgical problems. Finally, I don't want to leave the impression that the horrors of this period can be attributed to anything inherent in science or in medicine. It took a powerful state to concentrate and unleash the destructive forces within German medicine, and without that state, science would have remained impotent in this sphere. That being said, we've addressed the question at this conference, can it happen here? Is it happening? Is it happening here? I would simply like to remind you of the statement that if fascism, that used to be made, that if fascism comes to England, it will be wearing a bowler hat and carrying an umbrella. But let me also note that things come out of the closet in times of war or other economic or political crisis. What would have happened in America, for example, if the Japanese had invaded? What would have happened to the Japanese in the American concentration camps if the Japanese had managed somehow to invade this country? The reminder I'd like to say on this is that in times of crisis, then this is when things come out of the closet, and this is when we have to be prepared with our moral and our social critiques from advance. Thank you.
We have a message for Richard, Leibowitz to call home. We'll take a couple of questions now. If you would write them and pass them forward. Most of the questions we'll wait for until the end of the panelist discussion, but if you have one that you'd like answered right at the moment, please pass it forward. Two will do it. Robert, first question. We interned the Japanese but not the Germans. Why? Racial preference?
I think it was probably, is this working? I think it was probably the character of American racial views at this time, or racism, if you want. The Germans were probably the largest single ethnic group in the United States at that time, and were quite an old community there as well. The Japanese were a much newer community, and I would think that probably has something to do with it. The Asian was thought to be
Good morning. Welcome to the second day of the conference on the meaning of the Holocaust for bioethics. My name is Dorothy Vaughter, and I'm on the staff at the Center for Biomedical Ethics. It's a great honor for me to be asked to serve as moderator of this morning's session on Nazi policies concerning medical killing in euthanasia. Just to give a brief rundown on the format for this morning's session, Dr. Ruth Marmorstein will present a paper which will be followed by brief statements by members of the panel. Each panel member will have 20 minutes each, and they're not restricted to comment just on Dr. Marmorstein's talk. They may comment on the topic of medical killing generally. And after a break for refreshments, the panel will reconvene to discuss questions from you in the audience. The questions should be in written form. You've received some cards in your conference packets. We would prefer that you write your questions on those forms. Someone will be circulating through the audience to bring them forward. We scheduled quite a generous amount of time for questions, and so we really encourage you to write your questions, but remember to indicate on the card who it is that you would like to address your question to. I'd like to remind you that the conference is being videotaped, so we appreciate your keeping your movements in and out of the conference room to a minimum so that you will not disturb the conference or the quality of the TV production that is being made. And now it's my pleasure to introduce to you this morning's speaker, Dr. Ruth Marmorstein. Dr. Marmorstein has her doctorate in philosophy, and she's a professor of bioethics at Albert Einstein College of Medicine in the Department of Epidemiology and Social Medicine. Formerly, she was on the staff of the Hastings Center in New York, where she and Art Kaplan were colleagues. Dr. Marmorstein is author of 6 books, author or editor of 6 books, and more than 100 articles in the professional literature on ethics and bioethics. Her most recent book, titled Mortal Choices, was published in 1987 and was reprinted in paperback in 1988. She is currently serving on a World Health Organization committee that reviews research in human reproduction, most of which is being conducted in third world countries. Let's welcome Dr. Marmorstein. Thank you.
Thank you, Dorothy. I'm going to begin with a troubling case. A case that came before a recent meeting of a hospital ethics committee on which I sit was troubling but not uncommon. The patient, about 70 years old, had been brought to the emergency room with a fever of 107. Following her admission to the hospital 7 months earlier, she was given a diagnosis of status epilepticus. Now she's in the intensive care unit on a respirator from which she cannot be weaned. Brain damage is far-reaching. The doctors are having difficulty gaining access for the insertion of intravenous lines. The patient does not respond to stimuli, has already developed large decubitus ulcers, and requires regular suctioning and turning. A private duty nurse carries out these tasks of daily maintenance. The patient's family, her husband and 2 daughters, were told of the bleak prognosis from the beginning. Yet they insist that this level of care be continued. The husband refuses to consider the physician's suggestion to write a do not resuscitate order for the patient. Contrary to medical evaluations, the family believes the patient is communicating with them. They refuse to believe the prognosis and hold out hope that the patient will recover. I said this case is not uncommon. The relatives of patients often demand treatment beyond the point where physicians are able to prevent death or restore functioning. Families sometimes maintain false hope in their grief or denial that a miracle will occur. Doctors are reluctant to ignore or override the wishes of a patient's family in such cases, not only out of fear of being sued, but also out of respect for next of kin as surrogate decision makers for patients who lack decisional capacity. Yet there was a troubling aspect to this case, which was the reason the physician sought the help of the ethics committee. The doctor has been pressured by the hospital administration to discontinue this level of therapy because of financial costs. The hospital is paying for the private duty nurse, and a bed in the ICU costs considerably more than one on a regular hospital floor. The patient is being given antibiotics as well as being fed artificially by tube with food and fluids to maintain her life. The physician believes he should be an advocate of the family of his patient, and that the right course of action is to honor their wishes about the level of care being provided. Yet he's being criticized, even threatened, by his superiors for refusing to make financial considerations the overriding factor. The message is clear that this patient is absorbing a disproportionate share of the hospital's resources. The physician told the ethics committee that the patient and her husband are Holocaust survivors, having spent years in a concentration camp. The family's experience under the Nazis underscores their unwillingness to forego life-prolonging treatments. Some members of the ethics committee wonder whether it is ethically relevant that these people are Holocaust survivors. No one makes the explicit suggestion that lowering the level of care would constitute euthanasia. Everyone agrees that continued biological life could not benefit the patient herself. Yet some committee members are deeply worried about the justification for withdrawing treatment. The patient is costing the hospital too much money. She has become a useless eater. Would it be an act of euthanasia to deny this patient her private duty nurse and to reduce the level of care by removing her from the ICU? The answer depends on the definition of euthanasia. Physicians at the ethics committee meeting were in unanimous agreement that the patient's death would be hastened if she received anything less than her current level of care. Yet the intention of lowering the level of care is to save money, not to cause the death of the patient. But her imminent death could be foreseen, if not directly intended. Nonetheless, death would not relieve the suffering of this patient, since she is unresponsive and the extent of brain damage precludes the possibility of her having any awareness. However, according to one viewpoint in the literature, people who are comatose are benefited by euthanasia even though they are not relieved of suffering. One member of the ethics committee suggested that the family be told that the hospital simply does not have the resources to continue to provide this level of care for this patient. Is the patient's family mistaken in thinking that withdrawal of care bears any resemblance to what happened in Nazi Germany? What I want to do next is talk about the issue of euthanasia under the Nazis and today, and identify three approaches, that is, three approaches to a comparison or the use of comparisons or analogies. No ethical indictment is more devastating than the charge of Nazi practices. Yet the temptation to issue that indictment often surfaces when euthanasia is mentioned. Although it's hard to remain dispassionate in any discussion relating to the Holocaust, several questions deserve sober reflection. Were there any aspects of the euthanasia program under the Nazis that could legitimately be described as euthanasia in our sense of the term? Is there a clear and unequivocal meaning of the concept of euthanasia today? Are there any relevant similarities between medical killing, as it was called during the Holocaust, and recent biomedical practices involving termination of treatment? If there are such similarities, does ethical consistency require that we accept or condemn both? Three general approaches to this set of questions can be discerned. To be sure, there are differences in style and method among adherents of any one approach. But to understand and analyze the overall debate, it's useful to draw the boundary lines with broad brushstrokes. The first approach finds all too many similarities between the Nazi euthanasia program and what goes on in hospitals today. The second approach argues against the meaningfulness and accuracy of alleged similarities. The third approach, not really an intermediate position between the first two, but different, is one that sounds a cautionary alarm about the dangers of the slippery slope. In the first group are those who find unacceptable current practices involving termination of life-sustaining treatment. Some in this group hold that euthanasia, by definition, is morally wrong, That is to say, when the term euthanasia is applied to an act or practice, you are essentially condemning that act or practice. And this group holds that today's practices are all examples of euthanasia. A more nuanced view claims that a great many contemporary biomedical practices have ideological roots similar to those of the Nazis. Proponents of both viewpoints use Nazi allusions and comparisons to buttress their account. An example of the definitional indictment, that is, the group that holds that euthanasia by definition is morally wrong, an example is an inflammatory article entitled "Hitler's Euthanasia Program, More Like Today's Than You Might Imagine." It begins by asserting, and I quote, "Today we are faced with the prospect that our society will accept and legalize the crime of euthanasia for which Nazi doctors hanged at Nuremberg." The article uses the phrase "today's death lobby" to refer to advocates of patients' right to refuse life-prolonging treatment, and identifies a, quote, "whole breed of medical ethicists in the service of death, whose vocation is to tell doctors, hospitals, families, and clergymen that it is highly moral to kill helpless patients in American hospitals." You'll probably be interested to know that among these, this breed of medical ethicists is our own beloved Arthur Caplan, and also George Annis, who's with us here in the audience. They weren't too accurate, these writers, because they got George Annis's name right, but they mistakenly placed him in Montefiore Hospital in the Bronx rather than at Boston University. I think confusing him with John Arris, my colleague, who is also one of this alleged breed of medical ethicists. A more careful and nuanced article by Richard John Newhouse serves as an example of the view that active euthanasia is morally prohibited, and moreover, it is always wrong to withhold or withdraw certain medical treatments. Entitled "The Return of Eugenics," this article by Newhouse argues that Nazi Germany's doctrines and practices, quote, "effected but a momentary pause in the theory and practice of eugenics. Today, eugenics is back," he writes. Newhouse asserts that the question of euthanasia is an integral part of the progress of what he calls the eugenics project. The meaning of eugenics is broadened here to include, quote, "new ways of using and terminating undesired human life," as well as other biomedical practices the author deplores. Now, that's the first approach, variations within the first approach. The second approach is at the opposite end of the spectrum. Writers in this group seek either to deny definitional equivalence or factual similarities between the Nazis' euthanasia program and today's examples of foregoing life-sustaining treatment. First is the attempt to sever the very meaning of the concept of euthanasia from the Nazi program that went by that name. In an article, a rather scholarly philosophical article, whose purpose is simply to define the term euthanasia, Tom Beecham and Arnold Davidson dismiss an entire range of examples, claiming that, quote, "some actions which have commonly been denominated euthanasia, such as," they write, "the overused Nazi examples, would not be euthanasia on our definition." Seeking to provide a definition which dictates no moral conclusions, these authors argue that the concept of euthanasia, quote, "includes no inherently evaluative component." They write, "Murder entails wrongful killing and therefore possesses both prescriptive and descriptive force." That is to say, it is both a normative concept and also a descriptive concept. But euthanasia, they claim, is not analogous. Not only do they argue that euthanasia, at the term euthanasia, is devoid of a negative evaluative component, they also claim that the term euthanasia lacks a positive evaluative component, despite its derivation from the Greek word for good death. Thus, Beecham and Davidson argue it is not a contradiction to say an act of euthanasia is immoral. On their account, correctly describing an act as an instance of euthanasia is one thing. Evaluating a particular act, its rightness or wrongness, described as euthanasia is quite another. A variant of this second approach to the question of comparisons between the Nazi euthanasia program and today's medical practices takes the position that not only do certain concepts used by the Nazis differ in meaning from their current usage, but also there are great factual dissimilarities between what the Nazis were about and what goes on today. This denial takes several forms. One focuses not on euthanasia, but on other concepts, most notably the concept quality of life. In an article entitled Quality of Life and the Analogy with the Nazis, Cynthia Cohen provides a detailed explication of how the Nazis used that phrase, arguing that their use was radically different from our own. The Nazis viewed quality of life of individuals only in terms of their social worth, how they were of service to the Volk, as we heard yesterday. In contrast, Cohen maintains, a coherent quality of life position is grounded in a theory of the value of human beings with a capacity for self-reflective deliberation and action. It explicates the meaning of quality of life according to human beings, the meaning of quality of life of human beings in terms of standards of individual well-being rather than in terms of social worth. So for Cohen, you can legitimately use the term quality of life and make it center on the individual as the quality of that life is from the individual's perspective and not at all how that quality contributes in any way to social worth. Yet, even when its meaning is confined to standards of individual well-being, the phrase quality of life poses the problem of determining how high or how low a standard of individual well-being is acceptable. In a long-standing debate surrounding the ethics of allowing handicapped newborns to die, standards have been proposed, that is, standards below which they need not be kept alive. In this debate, standards have been proposed that many people consider unacceptably high. An example is the criterion stated by John Lorber, who was a British pediatrician, in an article written some years ago, and his standard of acceptable quality of life was the ability to work and marry. A more direct form of this approach focuses on the term euthanasia itself. Such terms, when applied to the Nazi experience, according to Lucy Davidovich, such terms, quote, do not have our meaning. She writes, these terms and the programs they stood for were integral aspects of Nazi racism. Nazi racism derived from a theory about the ultimate purity, or the ultimate value of the purity of the folk. This observation by the historian Lucy Davidovich makes only half of the comparison, however. It fails to specify our meaning, assuming that there's a single meaning, which there is not, of the term euthanasia. Before proceeding to the third approach, which finds both similarities and differences between the Nazi program and today's practices, this is a suitable place to pause for the obligatory conceptual inquiry, an inquiry into the meaning of or definition of the term euthanasia. Although there is not a single definition of the term euthanasia, there is a core meaning common to a number of leading candidates. To cite only a few of the definitions that have been offered, and there have indeed been many offered, I'm citing only a very few here, and I'm just going to run down these definitions. First, the painless inducement of a quick death. Second, an act or practice of painlessly putting to death persons suffering from incurable conditions or diseases. Third definition, the intentional putting to death by artificial means of persons with incurable or painful disease. And fourth, an act in which one person kills another person for the benefit of the second person who actually does benefit from being killed. Let me start with those four. Not only do these definitions differ substantially from one another, they're also open to fatal counterexamples. What are fatal counterexamples? Definition 1, the painless inducement of a quick death, could be applied to a simple case of murder, such as injecting a quick-acting poison into a sleeping person whom one hates. This definition also would permit accidental death to be an instance of euthanasia, namely the painless inducement of a quick death. Definition 2, an act or practice of painlessly putting to death persons suffering from incurable conditions or diseases, that definition too could also be a simple case of murder, such as injecting a quick-acting poison into a rich relative who has a mild case of multiple sclerosis, which is an incurable disease, without the relative's consent and for the purpose of inheriting the relative's wealth. Definition 3, the intentional putting to death by artificial means of persons with incurable or painful disease, that definition includes the vague and problematic term artificial, which I won't go into, but it has its problems, and, like definitions 1 and 2, also omits mention of the central intention, namely to end suffering or to benefit the person whose death is intended. Definition 4 comes closer to our intuitive understanding. That's the one that reads, an act in which one person kills another person for the benefit of the second person who actually does benefit from being killed. That definition comes closer to our intuitive understanding of the concept of euthanasia. But cast in terms of one person killing a second person, it rules out by definition situations in which suffering patients are passively let die rather than actively killed. Now, an attempt to summarize the relevant differences between the Nazis' use of the term euthanasia and what's assumed to be our current meaning appears in a historical study of Nazism. I'm one of the, I think, few people here who is not a historian, so I had to use all secondary sources. I did not go to the major archives, but I've used the work of other speakers on this panel and others who did use primary sources. So I'm going to quote here from the long opening paragraph from this book of the chapter that's entitled The Euthanasia Program, 1939 to 1945. Here's the long opening paragraph. In current parlance, the author writes, the term euthanasia refers to the practice of so-called mercy killing, that is, of painlessly ending the life, this is now definition 5, so listen to this one, of painlessly ending the life of a person who is terminally ill at his or her request, or if they are no longer capable of making such a request, then with the consent of their relatives. That's the definition. It's a highly controversial issue, this author writes, but it should not be confused with the Nazi euthanasia policy. For, although the Nazis used the term to describe their own program of killing over 100,000 mentally sick and handicapped persons from 1939 to 1945, their practice had little in common with the term as it is normally understood. Still quoting. In the first place, the decision to terminate the life of a patient under the Nazi program was taken not by the individual concerned or by his or her relatives, but by an official body. Secondly, the criterion for the mercy killing was not the welfare of the individual patient, but whether or not the patient's life was judged to be of value or worth, and of value not to the individual concerned, although the Nazis sometimes used this as an additional justification, but to the community. End of quotation. Now, the first condition proposed in this paragraph by this author, that the decision to terminate the life of a patient be made either by the individual concerned or by his or her relatives, is not part of the meaning of the term euthanasia. One might argue that for euthanasia to be acceptable, that condition has to be met, but it's not truly part of the meaning of the term, nor does it fully and accurately describe current or proposed practices. The second condition, that the criterion for mercy killing be the welfare of the individual patient, does capture the central feature of the concept of euthanasia, but whether or not the sufferer must be terminally ill, which appears in this author's definition, whether the sufferer must be terminally ill remains a matter of conceptual and ethical dispute. There is great uncertainty and consequently much ethical controversy about how to determine the welfare or best interest, to use another phrase, of individuals who are incapable of speaking for themselves. A classification scheme that's often used to elucidate the concept of euthanasia distinguishes 4 categories: active, passive, voluntary, and involuntary. Each category can be marked by a paradigm case, a clear case, yet conceptually and practically, these distinctions are easily blurred. In the following examples, let us simply assume that the intention in causing the death of the individual, in the cases I'm about to describe, let's simply assume that the intention in causing the death of the individual is to end suffering or to benefit the patient. A clear case of active euthanasia is the injection of a lethal substance into a patient with advanced metastatic cancer who's suffering extreme pain and discomfort. The act would count as voluntary active euthanasia if the patient knew she was in an advanced stage of incurable cancer, requested the injection, and believed the injection would cause her death. It would be involuntary active euthanasia if the patient were not consulted and her wishes were not known. Paradigm cases of passive euthanasia are ones in which a life-sustaining treatment is withheld. These are cases that are known in the bioethics literature as letting die rather than killing. A patient who requests to be allowed to die rather than being intubated and placed on a ventilator or respirator might be said to seek voluntary passive euthanasia. For some who consider the ethics of this practice, the case becomes more convincing as a relief of actual suffering if the patient had already been on a ventilator, found that mode of existence intolerable, and after once being weaned, requests that she not be reintubated, even if that's necessary or judged necessary to prolong her life. To ensure, furthermore with this case, to ensure that death by this means would be painless as well as quick, the patient requests that she be adequately sedated. An example, so that's active voluntary and active involuntary. Now, an example of involuntary passive euthanasia would be withholding renal dialysis from an irreversibly comatose patient whose kidneys have failed. The act is involuntary because the patient has not requested that dialysis be withheld. Since on virtually all accounts, continued life would not be a benefit to an irreversibly comatose individual, this case could qualify conceptually as euthanasia. Now note that I said it could, but here is where definitional uncertainty begins, leading to a conceptual debate. Does a good death, as premised in the concept of euthanasia, does a good death require that the patient be relieved of actual suffering? Can death itself count as a benefit to a person who is comatose or in a persistent vegetative state? Reasonable people disagree on the answers to these conceptual questions, and yet without agreement on that point, the boundaries of euthanasia remain fuzzy. According to one view, this is a direct opposition, a direct conflict in view. According to one view, patients in a coma, or PVS, persistent vegetative state, quote, are benefited by euthanasia even though they are not relieved of suffering, end of quote. An opposing view, and I think that comes from some of the things Jay Katz was saying last night about people's dignitary interests. That is, if there is such a thing as death with dignity, to use a perhaps overused phrase, the idea that people should be allowed to die without remaining indefinitely hooked up to artificial life supports, monitors, etc., is an aspect of death with dignity. So that's what lies behind that view that says people may be benefited by euthanasia even though they're not relieved of suffering. An opposing view holds that no definition of euthanasia is acceptable, which includes under its instances persons who are comatose. According to this view, this is because the concept of euthanasia should apply only in cases where the intent is to benefit a person specifically by relieving that person's suffering. Now, it's important to see this as a conceptual dispute, not as an ethical disagreement. There is virtually no controversy over whether individuals in a coma or in the unresponsive condition known as persistent vegetative state are experiencing suffering. Opponents in the conceptual dispute might disagree about whether withholding life supports from comatose individuals counts as euthanasia, yet they may still agree on whether it is morally permissible to forego the respirator. Conceptual debate is even more intense when it comes to drawing a line between active and passive means. Is the removal of life supports already in place active or passive? Many physicians insist that withdrawing treatment counts as active euthanasia. They argue that if they fail to institute life-prolonging treatment, it is the disease that kills the patient. But if life supports already in place are withdrawn, it's the doctor who kills the patient. This conceptual maneuver rests on an underlying ethical stance. Allowing to die is morally permissible, but killing is not. Yet that proposition is problematic. It brings to mind the rationalization used by Nazi doctors involved in the child euthanasia program. Some of those doctors left their institutions without heat, allowing the children to die of exposure. This enabled the doctors to offer the rationale that they were not engaged in murder, since withholding care was simply, as they put it, letting nature take its course. This illustration serves at least to show that ethical permissibility cannot rest simply on whether the means leading to death are active or passive. Indeed, there have been suggestions that active killing is sometimes more humane and therefore more ethically acceptable than allowing to die. That's the position taken by proponents of active euthanasia. When performed under limited specified circumstances and with adequate safeguards, a painless lethal injection is more humane, they argue, than letting the cancer patient die a slow, agonizing death. Among those who believe that active killing under certain circumstances can be ethically permissible are physicians who practice active euthanasia in the Netherlands, along with their supporters, and members of the Hemlock Society in the United States, along with those who signed a petition seeking to place a referendum legalizing active euthanasia on the California state ballot in 1988. Both the existing practice in Holland and the proposed plan in California permit only voluntary euthanasia, and both require that the patient who requests euthanasia be terminally ill at the time the request is made. Additional safeguards designed to prevent abuses are also built in to the practice in the Netherlands and to the now abandoned, but probably the proposal for California. At the other extreme are those who oppose any and all withholding of life-sustaining treatment, whether active or passive, voluntary or involuntary. And a more moderate group who draw the moral line at withholding food and fluids, or more generally at the boundary between what is termed ordinary and extraordinary treatments, or routine and heroic measures. Withholding food and fluids amounts to, quote, starving people to death, and it is argued. What could be more like the Nazi euthanasia program? Now I'll say a few words about the Nazi euthanasia program. The case that is said to have precipitated the first phase of the Nazi euthanasia program, known as the Children's Euthanasia Program, occurred in late 1938 or early 1939 and involved a handicapped child. As recalled by Hitler's personal physician, Dr. Karl Brandt, in his testimony at the Nuremberg medical trial, the child was born blind with one leg and part of one arm missing, and in Brandt's words, quote, appeared to be an idiot, end quote. In that case, the father had written to Hitler and asked for this child, or in Brandt's words, this creature, to be put down. From that small beginning, as it has since been called, Hitler launched the Children's Euthanasia Program, authorizing Dr. Brandt and another official, Philip Buhler, to deal with similar cases in the same way. Could it plausibly be argued that this was not a, quote, life worth living, as judged from the infant's point of view? Using the criterion proposed by John Lorber, the British pediatrician that I mentioned earlier, of an acceptable quality of life, namely the ability to work or marry, this child would probably fall below that line. Is it even possible to make an assessment of the value that that child's life could have for him? Jumping for a brief moment to a recent case, that of baby Doe, born in April 1982 in Bloomington, Indiana, we find that the infant's father did seek to make that assessment for him. Baby Doe was born with a correctable intestinal defect, an improperly formed esophagus. But he was also born with Down syndrome, the chromosomal anomaly that was formerly known as Mongolism. In the court proceeding that later ensued, the baby's father told the circuit court that he was a school teacher and had sometimes worked closely with Down syndrome children. He said that he and his wife were of the opinion that such children never had a minimally acceptable quality of life. The parents decided that it was in the best interest of baby Doe and also of their family as a whole to forego the life-preserving surgery. They understood that although efforts would be made in the hospital to keep the infant comfortable and free of pain, he would die within a short time, either from starvation and dehydration, since he could not be fed by mouth, or from complications leading to pneumonia. That was in 1982. In August 1939, a circular issued by the Reich Interior Ministry mandated a, quote, duty to report deformed births. All newborn infants suspected of suffering from the following congenital defects were to be registered, and here were the defects: idiocy and Mongolism, particularly in cases which involve blindness or deafness; microcephaly, an abnormally small head; hydrocephalus of a serious or progressive nature; deformities of every kind, in particular the absence of limbs, spina bifida, also known as neural tube defects, etc., and finally, paralysis, including Little's disease. Some of these infants were identified by assessors who did not actually examine them, and they were marked for death. This group was transferred to special pediatric clinics where they were either starved to death, given lethal injections, or died of diseases caused by malnutrition. Thus, some of these children marked for death were actively killed, while others were simply allowed to die. Their parents were pressured to allow the infants to be transferred to these special clinics on the grounds that they would be given optimum treatment. The stated reason, being given optimum treatment, was an obvious falsehood, which was clearly intended to deceive the parents about the purpose of the transfer. Although it was possible, or seemingly possible, for parents to refuse, they had to sign a declaration committing themselves to remove the children from the hospital and provide supervision and care. Again, in order to deceive, the cause of death was listed as a more or less ordinary disease such as pneumonia, which could even have a kernel of truth. That is, once the infants were left to starve or left in degenerating conditions, pneumonia did in fact often ensue and was the final cause of death, but obviously was the result of a long process. Now, this account I've just given very briefly of the Children's Euthanasia Program brings us to the third and ultimately the most interesting approach to comparisons between the Nazi euthanasia program and current practices of withholding and withdrawing life supports. That is, commentators on the slippery slope. Adherents of this approach, that is, looking at the slippery slope and trying to ascertain how slippery it really is, adherents of this approach cite the description by Dr. Leo Alexander, who worked with the United States Council for War Crimes in Nuremberg. Alexander wrote that the Nazi euthanasia program, quote, started from small beginnings. The beginnings at first were merely a subtle shift in emphasis in the basic attitude of the physicians that there's such a thing as a life not worthy to be lived. This attitude in its early stages concerned itself merely with the severely and chronically sick. Gradually, the sphere of those to be included in this category was enlarged to encompass the socially unproductive, the ideologically unwanted, and finally all non-Germans. But it is important, still quoting from Alexander, it is important to realize that the infinitely small wedged-in lever from which this entire trend of mind received its impetus was the attitude towards the non-rehabilitable sick. End of quote. Well, assessing the slipperiness of the slope are three camps. One group contends that there are simply not enough similarities between the Nazis' euthanasia program and today's practices to cause concern that we have begun the dangerous slide down that slope. An example appears in a book by Helga Kuse and Peter Singer, who write, quote, "When the Nazis talked of a life not worthy to be lived, they meant that the life was unworthy because it did not contribute to the health of that mysterious racial entity, the folk. Since our society does not believe in any such entity," Kuse and Singer write, "there's no real prospect that allowing active euthanasia of severely handicapped newborn infants would lead to Nazi-style atrocities." A member of the opposing camp contests that assessment and the likelihood of sliding down that infamous slope. David Lamb writes, "An immediate reaction to Kuse and Singer here is that racism in our culture is very much alive, and that the homogeneity presupposed by the expression our society simply does not exist. However, it may be the case that despite the existence of racism in Western society, contemporary medicine does not have notions of the folk at its core. But there is an increasing concern with social utility, which may turn out to be not that far removed from the Nazi standpoint." So writes David Lamb. How far removed a current concern might be from the Nazi standpoint is difficult to determine. Consider a statement made in 1984 by a physician following the passage of amendments to the Child Abuse and Neglect Prevention and Treatment Act and the ensuing federal regulations. This was the whole baby doe business as part of this extended period. Here was a remark by a physician that was quoted in the, written by him and quoted or cited in the Medical Tribune in December 19th, 1984. "The law now states that in obstetrical units, babies must be fed and given full support regardless of how extensive and hopeless their congenital malformations. Despite the law, the debate continues. The question must be viewed not only in light of the individual's right to life, but in that of society's right for its members to have pleasant and productive lives, not to be lived mainly to support the growing numbers of hopelessly disabled, often unconscious people whose costly existence is consuming so much of the gross national product." End of quote. 1984. Those who are quick to dismiss all attempts to compare the Nazi euthanasia program with current attitudes and practices should reflect soberly on whether society has a right for its members to have pleasant and productive lives. The driving force behind the Nazi program was the perception of growing numbers of hopelessly disabled people who consume so much of the gross national product. Hitler's adult euthanasia program had a separate organization and history from the children's program. It began with a statement in August 1939 by Philip Buhler, then head of the party chancellery, that the purpose of eliminating persons having a life unworthy of life was not only to continue the struggle against genetic disease, that is the eugenics program, but also to free up hospital beds and personnel for the coming war. At a meeting of the steering group in October 1939, this statement of purpose was translated into a cost-benefit assessment of how many would be killed. I'm glad Art Kaplan mentioned cost-benefit yesterday because it feeds right into what I'm about to say. Here's the statement. Quote, "The number is arrived at through a calculation on the basis of a ratio of 1,000 to 10 to 5 to 1. That means Out of 1,000 people, 10 require psychiatric treatment. Of these, 5 in residential form. And of these, 1 patient will come under the program. If one applies this to the population of the Greater German Reich, then one must reckon with 65,000 to 75,000 cases. The program, as outlined there, proceeded according to schedule, and by the end of August 1941, when the gassing phase was ended, 70,273 people had been killed under the auspices of this program. When the question was posed of how the killings would be done, the initial answer was again arrived at by a cost-benefit analysis. And I quote, "The number referred to by party comrade Brack also tallies with another party comrade's own estimation. It makes the proposed method of injections put forward by Professor Nietzsche unviable. For the same reason, the use of doses of medicine is also impossible. The question has been discussed with the director of the Reich Criminal Police Department. We are in agreement with him that carbon monoxide is the best method." As for just which inmates of psychiatric asylums were to be selected for the euthanasia program, the criteria for assessment were periodically adjusted. Initially, patients who could perform useful work were to be excluded from this action, as well as people